Good afternoon, everybody. The next three sessions are without a break. We now have in this session J. Sai Deepak, counsel in the Supreme Court and author, in conversation with Alo Pal about his book, India, Bharat and Pakistan, The Constitutional Journey of a Sandwich Civilization. Different sound. Isko we have to speak into that.
Okay. Jai Shri Ram, am I audible? Yes. Okay, good.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this post-lunch session. We deliberately kept it with Sai Deepak, knowing full well that all of you will come back post-lunch. So, Sai Deepak, thank you for a second book of equally interesting and disturbing information, just as the first one was. I think what you exemplify is new perspectives to old facts that we already know. So I will not present what the book is all about. I think that will emerge in the course of the talk. So in your first book, you basically talked about the impact of European coloniality on our consciousness. And me being an urban Indian city dweller, obviously it made me think a lot, especially since I teach the Enlightenment and I had to give a completely different gaze to it. This time you have decided to look at similar timelines, but you have delved into Islamic, Muslim, Middle Eastern coloniality, as you call it. So, first of all, why did you find it necessary to, what is the perspective that you wanted us to change or reset in our minds by delving into this subject in the second volume?
Since you have read the book, what did you make of my intention as the reader?
Well, the fact is that if you are aware of what's happening in India today, then these are the questions that you've addressed in the second book. Give certain answers and indications as to why, where we are going with certain policies, where we are going with certain ideologies, and the consequences that the majority is facing. So it really helps in understanding that. So the preparation to what we are today is, I think, what you have. But why am I answering this question?
Did you see a parallel between the past and the present? Did you?
Yes, I do, and that's my last question to you, in fact.
That was the intention.
Okay. So
that was precisely the intention.
Okay.
Because the idea was not to indulge in any kind of an academic exercise. By the time I was done with the chapter on Mopla riots, and while I was going through the material, I consciously stayed away from my family. So my family lives in the first 2 floors, I live on the 3rd floor in my office. And
is it loud enough?
Yes.
Huh.
I avoided meeting them, because I know for a fact that the material was filling me with a lot of purpose and, let's call it, dark energy. And the idea was to see if there is a way that I could transmit what I was feeling to the audience. Not necessarily the dark energy, but that sense of purpose. Because you had Nupur Sharma, you had Praveen Nettaru, a spate of killings in Mangalore. People are not paying attention to what is actually happening on the streets of Mangalore right now, and it is reminiscent of what was happening in 1920s. I know for a fact that a number of people who went for election rallies in Wayanad and other places, despite having police protection, had to leave the place merely because 2 or 3 boys in motorcycles with green flags would turn up and say, leave. And that's the end of the matter. And this is in 2020, 2021, and 2022. So I couldn't see a distinction in the situation, in the quality of the situation. Perhaps I would actually go to the extent of saying that it is even worse at this point, simply because of the self-imposed fetters that we have as a community put on our ability to speak about the truth. And second, I think that the current dispensation is making the very same mistakes as the Congress of the 1920s.
So, if we go to the beginning of the book, there are 2 things that you discuss. One is the Muslim movement to purity. There are 2 interesting contradictions, in my opinion, that drive it. One is a sense of massive insecurity of the loss of power. And second is somehow a certain entitled notion that they were the rulers and they need to rule back. So that is a movement that drives it. And the second one is the impact of English education. So on the one hand, you have an entire brood of clerks, non-thinking moderates who emerge out of this English education. And on the same hand, you sort of attribute exposure to English education to a certain revival of nationalism. And then can you please explain to us as to why the Muslim community were late in catching on to English education and why they did it? Because their motives are very different. So if you can explain these 2.
So one of the things that I was trying to showcase in the second book, so the first book effectively lays out a broad thesis in terms of what is the impact of European coloniality on Indian minds. But that would be a very monolithic approach to the entire situation, because obviously the 2-nation theory was a reality on the ground, which means both the nations, meaning the Hindu nation and the Muslim nation, were receiving this English education very differently. Hindus, I would say a significant portion of them, those who embraced English education, were doing so to climb the social ladder, and also they had refashioned their own approach to dharma on Protestant lines. The Brahmo movement being significantly one of those examples, according to me. And therefore, they wanted to perhaps do away with those aspects of their culture which they felt held them back from being a part of the new modern civilized world. And they had almost no conviction in the metaphysical, let's say, foregrounding of Hinduism. And they were happy to be a part of this elite club. Now, Muslims consciously stayed away from English education, perhaps because they were acutely aware of education's role in transmission of culture, including the role played by language. And in that sense, Muslims were sharper, better informed, shrewder, and far-sighted in not embracing English education. And they stayed away from it significantly. And this was a conscious call which clerics and families issued to their own children, saying, do not embrace it under any circumstances. Should it come to that, start with Islamic learning and then go to English learning. And that is the hybrid model that Syed Ahmad Khan comes out with. So the one is the question of the means. The second is the end goal. Hindus, represented by the Congress, represented by the moderates, were interested in being part of the English empire. They make no bones of it. They're absolutely clear about it. Anyone who aspired for freedom and complete independence was branded a lunatic who should have been committed to a mental institution, according to them. These were statements issued by Gokhale and others, the political mentor of Gandhi. And these statements were not isolated statements. This broadly represented the DNA of the Congress until the emergence of the extremist faction within the Congress. And since the extremist faction was effectively marginalized and relegated to the sidelines, the moderates represented the mainstream of the Congress. So a dominion status or a status at par with Australia, New Zealand, Canada, this was the end goal of the Congress. Whereas Muslims were clear, and Syed Ahmad Khan says it abundantly clearly, where he says, I am no fan of the British man or his culture, but I need his help to prevent the resurgence of Hindu political rise. And I need his help to ensure that members of my community infiltrate the system using English, but not drowning in the ocean called English culture. And that was effectively the ball that he set rolling. And I think that ball continues to roll even in 2023.
Now, between Syed Ahmad Khan and the brief role played by Afghani, I think that is capital, because in the events that will ensue, especially with the very first, not even the First World War, preceding the First World War, the very first skirmishes that Italy has with Libya,
Right.
you have this spirit of pan-Islamism that is almost, it's guttural, it's woven in the DNA.
Right.
So between Syed Ahmad Khan's vision and Afghani's attempt to put in, like, can you explain to us up until then, if in the revivalism, purity, was pan-Islamism a part? And what exactly happened with maybe the tottering of the Ottoman Empire that gave this absolutely visceral anger in the Muslims towards pan-Islamism?
So you see, this is an interesting question in the backdrop of the current government's celebration of the Khilafat movement as part of the Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. When you read the history of this particular period, it is positively embarrassing for anybody to celebrate the Khilafat movement as part of Bharat's move towards independence. First of all, it wasn't an independence movement. In any case, if you do have to celebrate it, what is the point of co-opting this manifestly pan-Islamist movement? I don't understand. So there are 3 or 4 key figures who emerge around that particular period, which is until 1898. I think in September or November, when Syed Ahmad Khan passes away. So you're looking at a period between 1830s to 1898. Now, the 2 key figures, one international and one national, who collide and who perhaps ought to have collaborated, are Syed Jamal al-Din Afghani and Syed Ahmad Khan. So Afghani happens to be one of the foremost Muslim intellectuals of the 19th century, who is significantly responsible for rekindling pan-Islamism from Egypt to Turkey to Bharat. And his stay in Bharat is not understood enough. And his stay in Delhi and Calcutta and in the seminary called Madrasa-e-Rahmiya of Dehlavi, which is also the alma mater of Syed Ahmad Khan, is not understood enough. Now, this man effectively says that in order for Islam to revive itself, the concept of a caliphate must be re-established. Now, he tries to somehow rekindle the fire in Egypt. You have to remember that before Turkey became the center for Islamic caliphate, it was Egypt. So the Mamluk dynasty loses to the Ottomans, and then the caliphate passes on from Egypt to Turkey. And then they become vassals of Turkey in a particular sense. That entire region is governed by Ottomans through their governorates. Now, the French and English establishments are desperately trying to install their puppets in Egypt. So there is a fight that goes on between Muslim nationalists of Egypt and that particular region and the collaborators of the British. Ultimately, the collaborators win. Afghani is responsible for leading student protests in Egypt around that particular period. So once the collaborator comes to power, he kicks him out. So this man is an itinerant, moves from Egypt, goes to Afghanistan, tries to rekindle Islamism through the Emir of Afghanistan, doesn't succeed there because the British kick him out. So from there he comes to Bombay, spends time here. From here he goes to Turkey. And he lands in Turkey, dies in Turkey ultimately. He is imprisoned by the Ottoman Sultan and he dies there. But before he goes, he spends a significant amount of period trying to understand the role that the Indian Muslim population can perhaps play in the revival of the caliphate. And he does a fantastic analysis of it. His stay is significantly responsible for mainstreaming Wahhabism further, which was already a fairly mainstream strain of Islamic thought in this country, and the importance, integrality, essentiality, and criticality of jihad in the establishment of the Islamic Caliphate. He reinforces it brilliantly. And his students are the first education minister of this country, Maulana Azad, along with the founders of JUI. I think Maulana Madani spoke a few days ago, calling Islam the oldest religion in the world and that Bharat is apparently the home of Islam. That's his statement now. So these organizations effectively learned from Afghani, because you see his publication. So he gets kicked out from here, he goes to Turkey. Before he goes to Turkey, he spends a brief period in France. Now France decided to shelter all those people who were working against the British, like Pondicherry. Okay. So like Subramania Bharati worked from here, Afghani worked from France. And so he comes out with publications. Now those publications are banned in Bharat. But somehow those newspapers and those publications find their way to Islamic institutions here, and they read and they say, this man has given a fantastic way forward in terms of a map as to how do we rekindle and revive the Muslim establishment of the world. And then they start working here actively. This is just before the Khilafat movement. This is just before the outbreak of the First World War. And once the First World War starts, then the divided loyalties start. Now, what is the role of Syed Ahmad Khan and what are his interactions with Afghani? Syed Ahmad Khan until then is effectively seen as the intellectual leader of Muslims in Bharat because he is showing them a fantastic way. He has established a brilliant institution by way of the MAO, which hadn't become Aligarh by then. Aligarh was renamed as Aligarh only in 1920. So he says, he's basically telling Indian Muslims, do not concern yourself with pan-Islamism or with what's happening in Turkey, because you have to deal with the realities of your existence, which is to keep the Hindu away from power as much as possible. And in order for you to do that, you need to collaborate with the English. So do not take an anti-English position here. And if you start interfering with the power struggle between the Ottoman Empire and the English Empire, you are endangering your position here, has been his position. So when this man comes here, Afghani comes here, he effectively calls out Syed Ahmad Khan as a British collaborator. And he says, you don't have the confidence in the Quran, you don't have the confidence in Hadith, you don't have confidence, you are effectively a believer of natural law. He writes a book where he coins this derogative word called natury, which is, it's an Urdufication of the English word, which is anybody who believes in natural law is called a natury. So he writes a huge criticism of these people, saying these are Darwinists who are anti-Quranists, so on and so forth. And this fight effectively decides the way forward for the Indian Muslim population's, let's say, course of action. Syed Ahmad Khan, according to me, lost this battle. For two reasons. This was almost close to the fag end of his life. And Afghani was relatively young. I think the man died before he turned 60. In his mid-50s, he died. And this man came in with a lot of vigor. And all those people who felt that the pace with which Ahmad Khan's vision wasn't taking effect got a lot of, let's call it, they got the right kind of kick that was needed through Afghani's sermons here. And then when he goes to Turkey, in his detailed exposition to the Turkish Sultan, he explains the role that Afghani Muslims and Indian Muslims will play in establishing the caliphate, because they have numbers, they have educated Muslims from the Bengalis, they also have money, and they are in perhaps control of among the largest swathes of land possible. So considering this tussle decides the way forward, and this immediately precedes the outbreak of the Khilafat movement. Okay? So I think that period needs to be understood better. Subsequently, the Aligarh movement, realizing that it is falling behind because of Afghani's influence, also adopts the very same course of action. So this is what happens. And Hindus were doing Bhajan Mandali for the British all this while.
So this is there are two strains you follow. So this is the Muslim strain in the book. The other one is initially, let's call it the Congress before it splits. That is, as you explain, is actually a safety valve to contain and give a channel of opinion expression to the nationalist movement that was burgeoning at the moment.
Correct.
Okay. So now contrast this with 1885 to 1905 and the achievements of Congress therein. And the realization of the revolutionaries of 1905 and what the Muslims achieved between the establishment of the Muslim League and the concessions given to them in the Morley Minto reforms. You know, just give us the timeline so that we understand exactly what was achieved in 20 years and what was achieved in 2 years and how.
So you're looking at the establishment of 3 different organizations. Congress under the leadership and under his vision in 1885. The Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental Education Conference, which was established in 1887 by Syed Ahmad Khan. Then December 1905, 1905? Yeah, it's 1905 is when, 1906 is when Muslim League is established in Dhaka. Now from 1885 to the Surat split of 1807 between the Naramdal and the Garamdal, the Congress is doing only 2 things. Give us more representation in the bureaucracy. Give us more representation in the bureaucracy. We want more sane policy making. And ensure that the examinations that are held for the civil services between England and India are the same, the pattern is the same, the syllabus is the same, everything is the same. That's all they were fighting for, nothing beyond. The fight between 1885 until 1905 was for greater representation in the bureaucracy to be a part of the colonial administrative infrastructure and gradually moving towards Swaraj. And Swaraj was defined as staying within the confines of the empire as its dominion. Between 1901 and 1905 or 1906 is when you see a serious emergence of the then right wing, or at least the extremist faction, by way of Balganga, the Lal Balpal trio, and then you have Sri Aurobindo, and then you have Annie Besant, so on and so forth, who said that, what are we fighting for here? To ride on the coattails of the British? Or are we trying to regain our own Sanskriti? What is it that we want here ultimately? So there is a very clear fight here, which is why I would call them perhaps the forerunners of Indian decolonial thought in that particular sense. Of course, I know that the word decoloniality pricks quite a few, but still. I think this is how
in your defense, you've defined it very well in your book.
I've been fairly clear about it. I think some people are just resorting to mischievous interpretation. So the point is that they wanted to base the entire movement on Bharatiya ethos and civilizational ethos. And they were very clear that this mirage called Hindu-Muslim unity would never be achieved, and even if it is achieved, it would come at the expense of our interests and to the advantage of their interests. Lala Lajpat Rai was very, very clear about it. His article on the case for Hindu nationalism is a must read. And despite being, perhaps as an Arya Samaji, how he felt about it, he is very, very clear about it. Now, so until 1905, this is what they do. But the emergence of the extremists, who ended up becoming the thought leaders for the revolutionaries, such as Tilak for that matter, who perhaps may have also be hand in glove with the assassins of Scott, I think, the Chapekar brothers, who killed the plague commissioner in Pune for his mishandling of the bubonic plague in Pune. Now, while this was happening, for the first time, people realize that they've been fooled by the Congress, which is seen as a status quoist organization and which is interested in being a sharer or a stakeholder in power with the British, and beyond that they had no aspirations. And since even that movement was really slow at a snail's pace, it's the extremists who start getting a lot of support, along with the revolutionaries. And they are the ones who are significantly responsible for pushing the Overton window. So the definition of independence or Swaraj is changed. The move towards saying that it's not about being a part of this establishment. We want them to get out of the place. And that conversation finally gets aired from the platform of the Congress for the very first time. Now, we have to be very careful about branding every member of the Congress as a collaborator, because unfortunately or fortunately, that happened to be the only significant political tent under which people could air their views. And since it enjoyed a certain degree of legitimacy in the eyes of the British, those who wanted independence too thought that they could actually be a part of this particular platform and push their agenda. So it was a big tent in that particular sense. Now, while all of this was happening, Muslims effectively see Congress as a Hindu organization, which the Congress never was. It was at pains to say we are a secular organization. Do not perceive us through the prism of the extremists or the nationalists, because it's a minority, it's a fringe, it's a lunatic fringe. They are cow lovers, and these are the people who are interested in preventing Go Hatya. They are the Gaurakshas of that particular period. So let us throw them under the bus. That was the position of the moderates. Now, when this happens, the Muslims effectively say the Congress has managed to create a political institution which seems to be getting a lot of traction from the British. While the Aligarh movement has done a great job of combining modern education and Islamic education, it is still a social movement, it is not a political movement. So they say we now need a political organization. And this conversation becomes sharper after the demise of Syed Ahmad Khan in 1898. So between 1898 and 1905, multiple events happen at the same time. Curzon arrives. He sees that, so he is deeply suspicious of the Congress, despite it being a collaborator organization. He says, no, these are stooges. They're double agents. You can't trust them, so on and so forth. So he says, I don't want to take a chance. I want to break that movement, and I want to break its back. And I also have enough administrative reasons to do so. And because Bengal is such a huge, sprawling province, I will have enough justifications to break it for administrative reasons. And the commissioners of Assam are also saying that in order for us to use the port of Assam for tea export and whatnot, Calcutta's primacy as the port needs to be brought down, and therefore let's break it away. And only then the railway tracks that have been laid in Assam and other places will actually find economic value. How do we otherwise generate the ROI for the investment made in the railways in Assam and other places? So this is effectively the calculation there. And he makes an active pitch to the Muslims of Eastern Bengal and Assam. Your Mughalistan will be back under us. For the first time, you will have the Mughal flag flying after the decline of the Mughal Empire, if you were to agree to this particular partition. For 6 months, the man goes about selling that particular proposition. Almost without exception, that proposal is purchased lock, stock, and barrel by the Muslim community. And once you have offered that, let's say, olive green branch, not the olive branch, so they are ready. And they say, now's the opportunity, and they latch on to it. And they push for separate electorates. And after pushing for separate electorates, when they succeed in the Minto-Morley reforms to get the separate electorates, by the end of that year, they establish the Muslim League. The pace with which the Muslim League moves after that, I would say the Congress was caught unawares. So what the Congress couldn't achieve from 1885 to 1905, Muslim League and its predecessors managed to achieve between 1905 and 1907. And this was the sharpness with which they moved, and this was the clarity with which they moved. I'm amazed. I have grudging, deep respect and admiration for what they achieved.
So one of the things that are spoken about your book is your citations. So you have a lot of quotes of parliamentary proceedings of the Morley Minto reforms. One of the things that really struck me a lot, especially because that collusion is very rife today, is that you actually had British members of parliament talking about Islam and Christianity being the religion of Abraham.
Correct.
And therefore that collusion is important.
Correct.
So can you explain that? Of course it infuriates me, it baffles me that, the so-called nation of the Enlightenment should talk and justify ceding the separate electorate and the 3/4 vote, actually citing the fact that the religions are of the same origin. So can you just, especially because this collusion affects us to this day.
Correct. So you see, after 1857, when the vast majority of the Muslim population comes under the radar for their participation, not in the independence movement, they actually wanted the revival of the Islamic flag. That much is very clear. I don't think we should even be celebrating it as the first war of independence. So there is a very clear documentation from Pakistan side of historians as well as Indian side of historians who clearly say that they were not fighting for an agnostic independence which is agnostic of religious identity and all that. They're very clear about it. Anybody who shouts Nara-e-Takbir at, let's say, in a fight is not being irreligious, because it's bound to be followed by Allahu Akbar. Okay, that is the slogan. So this was the war cry, and it's recorded in multiple places, and this was not limited only to the north of the Vindhyas. In Madras, these cries were, let's say, they joined them. Bombay, Madras, Hyderabad, and multiple places. Now, see, here's what happens. Just give me the last train of thought that you just, in the question, you said something in the question.
I talked about the collusion, the reference
I'll
of
come to
the
that.
common
Right.
origin of the religion.
So after 1857, what happens is, Syed Ahmad Khan decides to create a defense for Muslims, to say, no, we didn't participate in this. It was Ramdeen and Gangadeen who were participants in this mutiny, which is to say Hindus were responsible for it. We were not responsible for it. And then he clearly says anybody who issued a fatwa asking for jihad against the British was either an imbecile. He called Bahadur Shah Zafar a drunken idiot and an imbecile. He called all the mullahs who did this as people who did not know what Islam was and all that. So he creates the first line of defense. Then he starts saying, look, the native religion of this country is dictated by the priestly class, whereas Islam and Christianity are egalitarian. Plus we are of Abrahamic origin. So there must be a handshake between both the communities and we must form an alliance. Now alliance is typically adversarial in nature, which is you need an adversary against whom the alliance is formed. Now if the Christian and the Muslim are in alliance, who are they in alliance for and against is the question. Now when they say this, he actively also starts encouraging dinners between both communities. He asks Muslims to take up reading of the Bible to say, do a comparative study to explain how both of us are the same. And the other side also does this. When separate electorates were granted in 1906, one of the calculations that the British had was the immediate region surrounding Bharat has a lot of Muslim countries. Because you see, Turkey is right until, because it's the Ottoman Empire. You have Turkey, you have Afghanistan, you have all these countries. Therefore, in the interest of placating these interests, it's important for us to give separate electorates to Muslims. And between the two communities, they are more loyal to us. That's the clear statement that is made. So, this argument that the British was responsible for divide and rule policy or for sowing fissures, I'm sorry, it is such a Nehruvian Marxist BS. It makes really no sense. Which is why I said, if I were to, let's say, cite secondary propositions, which is to say commentaries, I would still be accused of citing someone's interpretation of it. Which is why I cited their letters and their parliamentary debates to say both of them are speaking of their common Abrahamic foundations. In which case, you are the idiot on who said they've literally, you actually have a dunce cap on your head because you constantly believe that this man is fighting with you against the British. That's not the case. Khilafat, by the time you come to that particular period, you realize, was a bargaining chip, which is to say, should you not restore the status of Turkey, we will take away Bharat from you because that is the crown jewel in the British crown.
Including orchestrating an Afghani invasion.
Correct. They specifically even suggested this. In fact, the Ali brothers with whom Mr. Gandhi had a great relationship, I don't know what was the nature of the relationship, he basically was open and he was mum when the Ali brothers also proposed the invasion of Bharat by the Emir of Afghanistan to drive away the British. Had it not been for Madan Mohan Malviya and I think Lala Lajpat Rai, Gandhi perhaps may have even agreed. Importantly, in a speech in Erode, which was delivered to an audience of Moplas, a few months before the Mopla riots, or Mopla genocide of Hindus. So, the senior Ali brother specifically says, when the Afghans come, we will fight every man who opposes the Afghans, including the Hindu. And this statement is related to Gandhi. He says nothing. And he continues with the movement after having been informed of this statement. Unbelievable.
So we have, but just before we come back to the Mopla and
We have Q&A as well, right?
No, the reason, two strains we need to talk about a little bit. One is that surely there was something that the Hindus also did right. Because as you point out, but since it's not the theme of your book, you do mention Sri Ramakrishna, you do mention Vivekananda. So what was the nature, maybe not as systematically networked, but there was something that the Hindus did right. And in continuation of that, you know, it could be considered the bedrock of the nature and the quality of the Swadeshi movement. So can you talk a little bit about that? And also, since we are already into the Khilafat, is it not evident for anybody who reads our history that while the petitions were being given to the government, or while the reforms were being proposed, the fact is that during the war you had the Defense of India Act. After the war you had Rowlatt Act. Anybody who wants to see the nature of the draconian, arbitrary, inhuman ways in which the British decided they could get away with suppressing any revolt, Is it not very clear by just those laws passed by the British that it's the revolutionaries actually that
Correct.
mattered?
Correct. So, two aspects. What Hindus did right,
Yeah.
I have touched upon it to a significant extent on the revolutionary strain of thought, but it will come better in the third book, where I will cover the Sangathan movement better. So, the first two books are an analysis of the triggers, and the next two books would discuss the responses from the Hindu side to this. Therefore, establishment of BHU in 1916, the Sangathan movement, and then the Sangams that were happening in Kashi and other places, which gradually led to the formation of multiple organizations, the Hindu Mahasabha, so on and so forth, and its offshoots. That will come out gradually. So just to be clear, there are about 5 or 6 movements that the third book will cover. The so-called Ambedkarite movement, the Sikh movement, the Dravidian movement, the communist movement.
So I will not ask you my question on the Justice Party now.
I've just given a brief paragraph explaining what's going to happen, where I've explained the origins of the Justice Party, as well as I've sown the seed for the Sikh movement here, because all of it happens around 1920, because everybody wants a share in the pie after the separate electorates have been offered to Muslims.
Yeah.
So all of this will come later. But Hindus did something right, but where they thwarted by their own co-religionists will be the subject of the discussion in the next book. Now, the other question that you asked was on?
If you see what the laws that British
Right,
enacted.
right, correct. So if you see all the legislations that they came out with, sedition law was to go after the Wahhabis.
Yes.
But every other legislation that came out subsequently, amendments to the penal code, were primarily to curb the activities of the revolutionaries. And the revolutionaries, as Mr. Sanyal said in his previous session, I was watching it online, they did a fantastic job of pushing the window. And the kind of, I'd say, see, it's like this. Revolutionaries were isolated by 4 stakeholders. The society at large, the moderates in the Congress, the extremists who couldn't openly own their allegiance or relationships with them, the Muslims who didn't want them, and of course the British establishment. So under these circumstances, with utter isolation, the revolutionaries operated. Imagine the kind of commitment that they had to Bharat for them to operate in these circumstances. Now, Mr. Sanyal said something very interesting about Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel's elder brother during the course of his talk. All you should do is this. Today, Sardar Patel looks great. Netaji looks great. All of these people look great. I would offer a simple litmus test. As long as these people were in the Congress, what was their attitude to the revolutionaries of that particular period? Did they bat for them? Did they give them intellectual cover fire? Or did they actively push for their prosecution and publicly castigate them? You will find very few Congress leaders who are not guilty of one of these things. And that would include the person whose Statue of Unity has been built in Gujarat. His letters will clearly show what he thought of the revolutionaries. So today, because we have Nehru and Gandhi as the soft targets, anyone who represents an opposition to them becomes someone worthy of co-option. But if you want to actually look at the, let's say, the history of that particular period better, revolutionaries represent, according to me, perhaps the purest strain of thought which comes close to Bharat's civilizational ethos, where I would say they kept the Kshatriya spirit alive. Every legislation, in fact, even prior to the 1919 Act, there's a huge report that comes out on seditious crimes. They hold the Brahmins of Maharashtra singularly responsible for fomenting revolutionary activity in Maharashtra, because he says, you see, the Maratha Empire was ultimately governed or finally governed by the Peshwas. Peshwas were Brahmins, so it's the Brahmin who is trying to revive his political status. And Tilak is a Chitpavan Brahmin. So this is how the discussion happens. It's not just about the religious identity, it is now the caste identity that comes out very clearly. And if you look at the enumeration of the trouble that they caused, and the report that actually is prepared, Punjab, Maharashtra, Bengal, across the country, and even in the south, astounding. So this was never a peaceful movement. It's a peaceful representation of an otherwise violent movement that was going on parallelly. And you have to realize that the revolutionaries were not even getting support from the press. Even the local press was pro-Congress, which is why they were forced to come out with their own mouthpieces. The Anushilan Samiti had to start publishing its own mouthpieces because they were not getting traction. So there's a very popular line in Rajkumar Santoshi's representation of Bhagat Singh, in the legend of Bhagat Singh, where he says, "Agar ye Congress cheekti bhi hai, to ye chap jata hai paper mein," which is actually the case, which is exactly what happened. These people did not get money, and these were educated people who realized what kind of nonsense they were being taught in schools and colleges, and they decided to. So I think, I hope through Mr. Sanyal's books and others' books, their history is done justice to. This much is clear. At every stage, the Congress was pushed to changing its position only because of the extremists and the revolutionaries. But for them, minus them, Bharat would have actually seen a very clear submission as a dominion to the British Empire. That was their clear-cut goal.
So the carrot of the home rule, and this is where you have to tackle two ideas, basically gives you the Hindu-Muslim unity phase. Now, discuss in your words the rationale of the Muslims riding on this catchphrase of Hindu-Muslim unity, what the moderates actually thought they would achieve by it. And I think we have to bring in Gandhi specifically in this point right now.
Tilak, Annie Besant and Gandhi.
Yes, you can discuss these three. And also the transition of Annie Besant from one to the other. So that's also a very interesting, I don't know they worked under what pressures, because, literally the motivation of the Muslims to actually collude with the slogan up to the time it suited them.
Right.
And I don't know, it's naivete or what of the moderates to do it, and Gandhi in it. So this bit.
No, they were actually playing the 1920s version of Chanakya Niti, so I'll explain what they were doing. So there are different sets of interests working. By 1914, moving to 1916, the Muslim community here is in a fix, serious fix. It doesn't know what to do, who to support, because you are midway into the First World War. Turkey joins this later, and there are several frantic messages sent from here to Turkey: do not jump into the World War because we will be forced to take a position. And we don't want to take a position which is anti-British. It endangers our interests here and our position in the global ummah. So please don't do it. Now, Turkey has to jump into this because it loses a significant portion of its territory in the preceding Balkan Wars. And therefore, it sees this as an opportunity to get it back. And around that period is when they also undertake the genocide of the Armenian population, which is significant. All of this happens. So, European powers may have an agnostic, irreligious motivation with respect to Germany. But their motivation with respect to Turkey is the re-establishment of Western civilization and Christian civilization in those parts of Europe which were previously Christian. So, it's not as if they had a monolithic approach to every participant in the World War. Depending on who the participant is, the motivations were very different, either territorial or religious or civilizational. Now, by the time it comes to 1916 and Turkey jumps into the war, Indian Muslims are wondering what to do. The British commit a few strategic errors at that point. Even during the World War, after the participation of Turkey, Indian Muslims have a wait and watch approach. They're waiting to see which way this war swings. Let's wait and watch. There is a Kanpur mosque incident that happens in 1916, where a portion of the mosque is demolished under the orders of the local collector and so on and so forth, and the temple is saved because of the Congress's proximity to the British. This movement or this particular incident is when the Ali brothers step into the picture. Both the brothers come to prominence because of this particular movement, and they realize, you know what, the Muslim League is dominated by those people who want to collaborate with the British, but we now need a movement because we are under attack everywhere, both within Bharat and outside. That's when the movement actually starts. And then they realize the Congress needs our support in some way to present a united face to get dominion status. The Congress realizes that as long as it does not have Muslim support, it cannot present a case for a single nation, because there can't be two nations for the grant of a nation statehood. That is why the two-nation theory is so critical, because the definition of a nation state is based on homogeneity in terms of either race or religion or language. So they say we need these people. So Tilak, Gandhi, before Gandhi, Tilak has already started this movement. Annie Besant has already started this movement because they have started the Home Rule Leagues. The Bombay branch of the Home Rule League is run by Jinnah, and he was a fantastic administrator of the movement. He did a fabulous job of it. I think the man acquitted himself in every role, better than Gandhi. So while this movement happens, they then realize the best way to get the British to take a few steps back from Turkey is to participate with the Congress and present Bharat now as the bargaining chip. And then comes the Lucknow Pact of 1916, which starts this golden phase of Hindu-Muslim unity in this country, which lasts for barely 3-4 years. And this movement dies a natural death by the time the purpose of the Khilafat movement itself is rendered infructuous by Kemal Ataturk, who effectively wins the war for the Turks and also demolishes the Islamic Caliphate, abolishes the concept of an Islamic Caliphate, and the so-called Khalifa has to flee Turkey in a British vessel. That is the final insult to the global ummah, which is delivered by the British with the icing on the cake. Now, by the time you're looking at the closure of the First World War, Turkey is lost in the first round when Kemal Ataturk has not come to power. And then you have the negotiations going on with respect to territories. So now the argument becomes of the Indian Muslims, restore every territory that Turkey has lost in the war. So Germany's territories will be taken away in Alsace-Lorraine and other places. But as far as Turkey is concerned, it should not suffer the same consequences as Germany. The British man and all these allied powers say, how do you expect us to treat Turkey differently when it has been an equal participant in this war? Why should Germany and Turkey be treated differently? Then they say, okay, if that is not possible, at the very least, preserve Turkey's control over what is known as the Islamic homeland, which means Palestine, Syria, Makkah, and Saudi Arabia, which is called that's where the whole thing comes from. Al Jazeera is actually named after this. The Jazeera, because that's where you have their holy shrines. This becomes the bargaining chip. All of this is rendered infructuous when Kemal Ataturk comes to power, and then he wins back his territories from Greece and other countries, which is Turkey's territories. And then he says, you know what? The presence of this caliphate in this country is single-handedly responsible for us being constantly at loggerheads with the West and everybody else. I'll take away the British suspicion that it might lead to Islamic revivalism by demolishing the concept of a caliphate altogether. So the first step that he does, he says, the Khalifa will no more be an individual. It will be the parliament itself, which has never happened in Islamic history. That creates a huge round of debates as to how can Khalifa be an entity as opposed to an individual. And then he says, I'll go to the next step and destroy that institution altogether, and he abolishes it. Once this is done, every reason that existed until then for Hindu-Muslim unity is gone. All promises made until then are retracted. But the Hindu side continues to live by its promise. And then starts the phase of riots, bloody riots. During the period of Khilafat, it continues in Bihar and other places in districts like Arra district, massive riots that go on. They get reported because the Hindu side responds in massive numbers, which results in greater concessions being given to the Muslim League by the Hindu side. So regardless of who causes that particular riot, merely because there's a retaliation from the other side in self-defense, Congress is expected to give more concessions in seat participation, regardless of the numbers. So in certain provinces, even if the Muslim population was less than 20%, their representation in the province's assembly would be over 50%. These were the kind of concessions that were extracted. And then once the riots start, by 1924, Kohad, Malegaon, Mopla, Malabar, all these places, it's over, done and dusted. So at best, 1916 to 1924, there is no concept of a unity before or after.
And Gandhi?
Gandhi was taking forward Tilak's and Annie Besant's role in the support of this Khilafat movement. But the one thing that he does is Tilak and Annie Besant had significant political standing independent of their support from Muslims. Gandhi's rise to political power is significantly on the backs of Muslims. And therefore, he is effectively held hostage to their support to continue being relevant. And there comes a point where Khilafatist hooligans take over Congress proceedings and shut out every dissenting voice to prop up Congress, to prop up Gandhi. And it is captured in the minutes of the Congress proceedings. Now, I'm not even fabricating this. I don't need to do a Romila Thapar here. So I know for a fact, which is why the proceedings are abundantly clear. So the man, for all his professions of non-violence, was comfortable being, let's say, being led by hooligans of the first order. His response to Mopla riots is nothing. His response to Kohat is, Hindus, please don't go back. Until Muslims of that particular region grow a heart and a spine and a conscience, please don't go back.
Kohat is significant because Kohat had a Hindu minority.
7%.
So while he talks about the rampant riots that took place all over India, nowhere was there displacement of Muslim population. But Kohat, where the minority was Hindu, there was actually a displacement of population. It's very, very reminiscent of Kashmir.
So the British troops who were stationed in Rawalpindi cantonment had to be called to evacuate the 7% population where 93% was Muslims. And Kohat is currently in NWFP. This is the nature of the so-called Hindu-Muslim unity. By the time Khilafat is done, everybody says, so Annie Besant, who was until then the extremist, moves to the moderate side. Because if extremism is Gandhi, with the support of Khilafatists, I don't want to be on this side. Because she said this is going to lead to anarchy. Not just that. There were religiously motivated defections in the army in favor of the Khilafatists, in the Muslim regiments. So, the Hindu population and leaders who were concerned for Hindu population safety were worried. If these kind of defections happen, and the British army is left defenseless, or it doesn't have the numbers needed, what happens to the Hindu population? Then these were the kind of concerns. Then they realized that this nonsense is not going to work. Let's go back to the Tilak model, where Tilak effectively said, don't fight for a place in the bureaucracy. Fight for a place in the Imperial Legislative Assembly and be a part of the change from within the system. So he changes the moderate's approach to colonial administration by saying that I might as well learn from Syed Ahmad Khan that if I can't fight them militarily, I might as well occupy those positions and change it. That leads to the establishment of the organization that Mr. Sanyal mentioned previously, the Swaraj Party. Motilal Nehru and all these people established the Swaraj Party and say that because of the non-cooperation movement, the Congress stays out of all the elections. Muslim League is constantly contesting in elections. And therefore, for them to become part of the legislative debates and for them to become part of the policy-making discussions, they decide to contest elections. The Justice Party comes around the very same period. Then you have the Singh Sabha set up across the country, which is, as Mr. Sanyal said, the precursor to the Khalistan movement, which is where the division starts between the Hindu identity and the Sikh identity.
So I will also, he ends the book with the Mopla riots, and I will also end my last question with it, because it's only fair that they ask you questions. But the way I'll do it is this.
How fair is it? 5 minutes?
Yeah. You wanted me to shut up earlier. So
I gave you a hint. You didn't get it. Go on.
So I'm being bullied. So the thing is that this is an extract from a book on modern India by Arjun Dev. I did a Twitter crowdsource information on this. It ruled the roost of India's education system for about 20 years at least. And this is what they say about the Mopla riots. The movement was a great success. I think this is for the non-cooperation. And the firings and arrests could not stop it. Before the year 1921 was out, 30,000 people were in jail. They included most of the prominent leaders. Gandhiji, however, was still free. A rebellion had broken out in some parts of Kerala. The rebels were mostly Mopla peasants. Hence, it is called the Mopla Rebellion. The rebellion was suppressed by terrible brutalities. More than 2,000 Mopla were killed and about 45,000 arrested. An example of the brutalities was suffocation to death of 67 Mopla prisoners in a railway wagon when they were being shifted from one place to another. Full stop.
Right.
So now please show the...
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's do a compare and contrast in how history is represented in this country.
And the reason why I say this is that institutionalized history books are teaching us this. This is the government of India commissioned history books from the NCERT that is doing this to us.
So here's a
where are we
comparison.
to go? Yeah.
69 people get burnt alive in Sabarmati Express. Subsequently, around 2,000 people are killed in Gujarat. The official numbers are close to 900 are Muslims and close to 400 are Hindus. Nobody talks of the 69 people who were burnt alive in the Sabarmati Express. Now, when it comes to the Mopla riots, we are only taught of the 67 people who were burnt in a railway wagon. How many people participated in the Mopla genocides? I have given the numbers after calculating it from at least 3 reports. Close to 49,000. 49,000 people were out with the Mopla knife. 49,000 people were the number of participants. And take it from me, this is the number of the average size of an army during those periods. If you're looking at the medieval period, or let's say the 12th or the 14th century, you're looking at 10,000 soldiers, 30,000 soldiers, and 40,000 soldiers. Close to 50,000 people were out on the streets. Caliphates were established in Kerala, in Malabar. Freedom was announced, and you had generals being established, kings being established, Islamic Caliphate kings being established, or caliphs being established. And how they went about killing these people, and the plunder goes on, I think, from August 1920 till February 1921 for a period of 6 months. 6 months. They had to bring reinforcements from Bangalore, from Madras, and so many places. They didn't know what was happening. Literally, law had taken a vacation. The British had absolutely no control over that particular period. They had to do search and combing operations for 6 months to kill them because it's a mountainous region full of wild terrain, which cantonments, let's say companies, coming from outside don't have any knowledge of. Exactly the problem that Indian Army faced with Ulfa in Assam or in Kashmir. So for 6 months this goes on. Gandhi continues. He continues. Relentless. Annie Besant writes stinging, scathing letters. Any other man should have committed suicide upon receiving that letter, if he had some sense of shame and conscience. She details how people were paraded naked. Falsified affidavits were filed before the Supreme Court by a so-called activist on ripped fetuses about Gujarat. But that was the exact thing that happened in Malabar. This was a reality, reported by multiple people, including Muslim members of the Congress who were writing to Gandhi, please take a note of this. I would only suggest a shortcut to reading my book. Don't read anything in between. There are only 2 chapters which according to me are strictly relevant. Chapter 1 and Chapter 9. Chapter 1 is how the two-nation theory began and what are its origins and how old are they. Chapter 9, the implementation of the two-nation theory on the ground. That's it, you're done. You don't need to read anything else.
Quick questions, anybody? Hands going up.
Yes, Anand, please, 30 seconds, please.
Where's Anand?
If he consumes 30 seconds in the question, it's not my problem.
That was an amazing session, Sai. I'll take less than 30 seconds.
Please.
2 very short questions. One, why do you think that this government is celebrating the Khilafat movement, 100 years of Khilafat? And number 2, is there such a thing as a moderate movement?
So I think the government is currently following the Chadar Bhejo policy. Ajmer ko Chadar Bhejo. Celebrate the Inquisitor of Goa. Co-opt Periyar somehow. I don't know what are these compulsions, especially when the government continues to enjoy the support of its core constituency. And as you said on a television debate last week, it is blessed with a joke of an opposition. So there are really no hardcore political compulsions here where there is a shrinking vote base or whatnot. So what is this audience that is being catered to? I don't understand genuinely. And coming to the second part of your question, all of us have learnt our lessons from the Nupur Sharma episode, so don't put me in a spot. Okay. All I will say is this. Computer and education will not change the mindset. I hope the government realizes that. Address the mindset head on, don't beat around the bush. Ho gaya. If the homeland, let's say, if the country of birth or the land of birth of Islam is addressing this issue head on, why can't Bharat, having suffered the consequences for at least 1200 years? I think there is a serious paucity of imagination, originality, and vertebracy on this particular front. That's all I have to say. Despite the achievements of the government on every other front, and despite me being a votary because there are really no other options, I would still say on this front, it's been a letdown. That is my humble opinion. I could be wrong, I could be trolled for this, but I will stand by this opinion because I'm backed by facts.
That's all, I'm afraid we have the time for. On to the next session. Thank you, Sai.
Some unforeseen circumstances.
Can someone switch off the AC? It's very noisy.
Good afternoon and namaste to everyone. This session was originally supposed to be me posing questions to the author about the book, Life of an Understanding. But the author, Shivkumar Verma, fell ill and was hospitalized yesterday, so he couldn't make it. by an amazing stroke of coincidence, this is also the school where my father, who is 92 now, studied right up to the 10th standards, and the plaque that is next are the names of some of the people who gave up their lives, some of them just 16, 17-year-olds, seniors to my dad, and some of the teachers of my dad. And after almost 80 years, both of us from the same family on the same podium. So that was just a aside. So the question is, this book of Kunal is a sort of an autobiography. I call it a sort of an autobiography, and I'll just kind of elaborate on why I say so. And the question is, why should anybody read this autobiography of a not so famous Indian military historian and filmmaker? Because from where I see this book, almost 80% of the book, or maybe even more, is what can be termed as contemporary history. Kunal, through his life as a journalist, as an author, and as a filmmaker, was eyewitness to some of the most iconic incidents of our country since the 70s and 80s. Take his father's stint into consideration, who was a brigadier general in the Indian Army, and even the 62 war, the 65 war, and the 71 wars. And each and every page of this book is replete with incidents where Kunal has gone ahead and not pulled any punches, and some of the chapters we were, as publishers, were very a little scared that maybe we get lawyers' notices and stuff like that. So far, it hasn't happened. It's almost 5 months now. So there are things like the 6 riots of 1984, the Operation Blue Star, the Bhopal gas tragedy, the Kargil war, the Siachen, the so-called attempted Siachen sellout in the 2000s, and the encounters and his stay with Hizbul Mujahideen for 5 days are all these incidents and many, many more which are there in this book. And I personally think that this is what I can call as the first draft of history, and going forward, some of the incidents will probably feature in history books in the coming years. Before I move on to the panel, I would just like to read a couple of pages from the book. Basically, these are the pages which, when shared with me about a year back as the first draft, sent shivers down my spine, and I think I will share them with you. It will not take more than 3 minutes, and then I'll pass it on to Sanjeev and Anandji. So this is from a chapter called Trial by Fire, the Sikh Riots. And it begins, on the fateful 31st October evening in 1984, when Delhi was beginning to see the beginnings of attacks on Sikhs in the aftermath of Mrs. Indira Gandhi's assassination, with the stolen papers from Vicky Graham's table burning a hole against my chest, I was not quite sure what I wanted to do. Driving my scooter almost instinctively, I turned from Parliament Street towards Cathedral Church of Redemption and then went up to the North Avenue and into Rashtrapati Bhavan. Usually there are at least 2 police pickets there, but no one challenged me. Even at the Rashtrapati Bhavan, there was not a soul. So I parked and went into the imposing building, literally walking into without being stopped or questioned by anyone. I entered a long room where a JCO ADC was sitting at a desk, but he either did not see me enter or he just ignored me. Benu's room was not too far away, and as I stood there wondering what to do, the JCO ADC got to his feet and Gyani Zail Singh wandered into the hall. I had twice met the president before and had been quite taken in by his spontaneous warmth. Taking the sheaf of papers out of my jacket, I walked towards him and wished him. The president did not respond. He just seemed to look at me with a blank, bewildered look. I started to say something, but I felt the JCO ADC's hand on my shoulder. I turned to look at him, and he indicated with a nod that I should leave the president alone. I looked again at Gyani Zail Singh. His face and eyes were blank. It was almost as if he was seeing nothing, hearing nothing. He turned and went back from where he had come. It was unnerving, to put it mildly. In Benu's room, I sat down on the bed and must have dozed off, for I was woken up by Benu, who asked me, "What the hell are you doing here?" Benu listened quietly as I quickly updated him, telling him I had stolen the papers from the Associated Press office
and then came straight to Rashtrapati Bhavan. I told him there were no police personnel on the roads and no one had challenged me on my way in. He knew I had tried to talk to the president. Presumably, the JCO ADC had told him. And he explained that Gyani Jal Singh was almost in a state of deep shock and he was being sedated. It was 9:30 p.m. It was 9:30 in the evening. And we both knew that the clock was ticking. Benu told me that the writing was spreading slowly and there were reports of tempos coming in from direction of Gurgaon with jersey and old tires and white spray was anticipated. The voters' list now left us both with no doubt as to what was being planned. Kunal, you go to my father. He's in Delhi area ops room monitoring the situation. I'll call my sister and she'll meet you outside the Flagstaff House. Get going. I was already halfway out of the door and ran down the imposing courtyard where so much history had been scripted. My trusted Vijay Super fired at the first kick and I was again racing down South Avenue right, then left, Teen Murti through to Kautilya Marg. All these areas were completely deserted. Not even a stray dog was visible. Even Sardar Patel Marg was deserted, as was the police post at Dhaula Kuan. I turned in at Pratap Chowk and reached the Mandir Marg and Mal Road intersection, where on left was General Jamwal's residence. Benu's sister Vandana was standing at the gate and she climbed on behind me. Headquarter Delhi area was just a stone's throw away from parking. We both half ran into the GOC's office. The staff there recognized Vandana and after a few minutes the general came into his office. He greeted me with his usual hello son manner and that he had received a call from Benu as was telling him I was on my way. Where is the fire? He asked. I told him it was spreading and even though South Delhi roads were still clear, there was already a pall of smoke around Ring Road. I handed him the sheaf of papers without comment. The general sank into his chair and started to glance at the sheets. Putting aside the page he had already seen, he probably ran through a dozen pages, after which he looked at me and said, "Where did you get this?" General Jamwal knew I was a journalist, but for some reason I felt I could not implicate Associated Press. I said I could not tell him where I got the papers from, but this seemed authentic enough. The general looked at me and looked at a few more pages, then called his ADC. "Take Vandana home, take my car." Vandana in turn looked at me and nodded and left. General Jamwal sighed and leaned back in his chair. He was looking at me and I presumed he was working out what course of action to take. When he spoke, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "I cannot do anything. I do not have the mandate. Or for that matter, the troops." I looked at him incredulously. He collected the papers and deliberately folded them back in their original shape. I extended my hand expecting him to return them to me, but he instead opened his drawer and put them away. "Leave this with me, son," he said again, shook his head. "I simply have no troops in Delhi." This was too much for me. I said that was not true, for I had seen at least 2 infantry battalions come down Ring Road earlier in the evening. Besides, 35 Infantry Brigade was in Delhi and 9 Infantry Division was in Meerut. "Get them," I implored. And then I added, there are enough Sevadars in Delhi cantonment who, even if armed with sticks, can stop any rioting by just their presence. Just a flag march in Tilokpuri, sir. Whoever these guys are, they will think twice once they see the army. Jamwal was now clearly irritated. His entire body language had changed. "There are no troops in Delhi under my command," he said. His voice still measured. "Son, you have had a long night. You got the papers to me, now go home." He then got up and left his office, leaving me to find my way out. I was devastated. Over to you, Sanjeev Ji Anand.
Thank you very much. I will confess, since I was dragged into this just last night, I have not really read the book. I glanced through it in between the last few sessions, so I've only read bits and pieces, but I've got a sense of it. It's really about, well, it's a journalist's life, but a remarkable, interesting life, where he has done a lot of things and been eyewitness to, of course, you talked about the Sikh riots, but many things, the Kargil War and many Siachen and all those kinds of things. So, I mean, it's a book I'm definitely going to read through more carefully after this, but since you specifically use this example of the Sikh riots and how it was in some ways carefully crafted. Many of the things that are actually blamed on Prime Minister Modi in Gujarat actually happened during the Sikh riots. And there is more than adequate evidence of this. What is even more interesting is that this was not the first run of this behavior. Exactly the same thing had happened to the Brahmins of Maharashtra after Gandhi's assassination. And so that is also interesting how this is quite systematic, and one should begin to ask the question whether it had something, the whole thing has something to do with these specific communities and their histories. I had in my talk talked about what had happened to the Maharashtrian Brahmins. You just talked about what happened to the Sikhs. Let me tell you about what happened to the Bengali Hindus, not just after partition, but what happened to them in India. I don't know if Deep is still here in the audience, but he's written a fantastic book about Mari Jhapi massacre. So let me tell you a little about what that was all about. Most of you will be aware that in 1970-71, there was large-scale ethnic cleansing and genocide in what is now Bangladesh, but was then East Pakistan. In that, there was 3 million, mostly Hindus, were killed. Muslims were also killed. There were many nationalist Bengali Hindus, Muslims who were also killed. But the bulk of that 3 million were Bengali Hindus. And about 10 million of them came into India as refugees in various places. Now, after the war was over, many of them did not want to go back home. Because in fact, many of those massacres had not been done by the Pakistani army, but by their own neighbors. So there was this real problem. Now, what was the political organization that these people could turn to? The Congress was not very wildly keen on dealing with them for their own political reason. So they reached out to the one organization or only political party that had some interest in their existence, and which was a party that many people now forget, is called the Revolutionary Socialist Party. Okay? The RSP is a descendant of the Anushilan Marxists I talked about in my first talk. So they were basically the revolutionaries who had drifted towards Marxism, but were still suspicious of the British and Russian influence on the Communist Party. So they had remained separate during the Second World War. They had not collaborated with the British. And then, because their hub was East Bengal, they had then converted themselves into something called the Revolutionary Socialist Party. Now, after independence, many of these people had got stranded in East Pakistan. So now that these 10 million people were in India, there was no party to organize them. So the only party to which they could sort of turn to was the Revolutionary Socialist Party. And so the Revolutionary Socialist Party did begin to organize some part of these 10 million Hindus who had decided to remain back. Now, as a part of the settlement of these millions of people, many of them were sent off to Dandakaranya. And now, of course, they were not used to the climate, they didn't like to be, and many of them wanted to be put back at least to West Bengal, where there was some cultural affinity. So in 1977, the Left Alliance came to power in West Bengal, led by the Communist Party of India, Marxist, CPIM, and Jyoti Basu became the chief minister. Now, one of the important parties of that alliance was the RSP. And the RSP basically encouraged the CPIM to basically invite these guys who had been sent off to faraway places like Dandakaranya, these refugees, to come back to West Bengal where they would be put up. Now, these rumors were then spread around in these refugee camps, and some of them began to move back. But of course, no arrangement has been made for them. So ultimately, some of these guys, encouraged by the RSP, ended up on an island near the edges of the Sundarbans called Mari Jhapi. And they began to just settle there. Lakhs of them, 2-3 lakhs of them just came and began to settle there, set up villages, began doing all kinds of things, fishing boats and all kinds of other things, and they began to settle there. Now this is the point at which how dirty politics takes place. Jyoti Basu realized that this sudden influx of RSP supporters would change the dynamics of what had otherwise been a CPM area. So he then basically surrounded the island, cut off food and water. By the way, there was not adequate water also on that island. And then sent in these parties of party workers and police to basically carry out massacres. Those who tried to escape, boats were sank. There were many people who actually died of thirst on that island. It's difficult to guess how many people died. It's somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000. Deep is not here, but he'll tell you, we don't really know how many people died. But it is by some margin the worst state-sponsored massacre in independent India's history. You don't hear a word about this. Of course, the RSP, which should have stood up for its own, did absolutely nothing. And one of the reasons the RSP basically disappeared in Bengal, because their whole image was that they had been revolutionaries, etc. They were shown up to be essentially cowards, and so consequently the party basically withered away. But I'm telling you this story because effectively what is mentioned here by Shiv is what he saw happen to the Sikhs, who were also an important part of the revolutionary movement. What happened to the Brahmins of Maharashtra also happened to the Hindus of Bengal, not just in Bangladesh and East Pakistan, but also to the refugees when they came over to India. This is unfortunately stuff that happened in living memory. Eyewitnesses of this are still alive. And yet, I grew up in 1980s Kolkata. Within 100 kilometers where all of this happened, and I had no idea it had happened. It's only when I was an adult and I read about it that I found out about this. This is the level of how this entire thing is being pushed down, and this history has not been told.
Yes, thanks very much. First of all, for me being on this panel, and as Sanjeev also said, Alo recruited us only last night, and I've barely been able to, skim through the book. So my apologies if I have probably even read less than Sanjeev has, and you know how confusing it can be. S.M. Krishna's predicament at United Nations. He was reading the Portuguese diplomat speech. Yesterday, Ashok Gehlot was reading last year's budget. So I don't want to be reading Sanjeev's book now, but a few things that I could very quickly glean out of what Shiv wrote. One thing that one of his chapters actually details about him being journalist and this labeling. And funnily enough, Sanjeev also talked about, when he talked about Bhagat Singh being communist and so many, and it's incredible how infected we all are at labeling each other, Sanghi, Darbari, Aptad, and God knows how many other labels that exist. Any other, like Qaumi is one. I'm from JNU, so I know about Qaumi. Any other label that I might have missed? Bhakt, yes, Bhakt is one, yes. I used to get very perturbed when I was called Sanghi and Bhakt, not anymore now, I take it as a Andhbhakt, yes, Bhajan Mandali, Bhakt, all those things, yeah. But and especially in the context of what Sanjeev said in his, during his short speech, was that India's largest trade union, AITUC, which is a communist trade union, its flag is a red flag with hammer and sickle. Do you know who founded it? Lala Lajpat Rai. So, this notion of who is a communist, who is a Sanghi, they were so superfluous then. And to be very honest with you, this whole thing about the communists, nothing was known about how treacherous the commies are. Sorry if I'm, please don't quote me out of this room because I have to go back to JNU. And the fact that they killed 100 million people, they hadn't committed all those crimes at that point of time. Nobody knew about, the real, how the mind of Lenin ticked. Nobody knew that Stalin would go on to kill 10 million people. In fact, not until 1960s, when Khrushchev himself talked about the truth about Stalin, did people get to know about Stalin. And even now, believe it or not, you go to YouTube, some JNU professors still do not believe that it was Khrushchev who was telling the truth about. They say that it was CIA's someone who had actually planted that thing, and the words, the lip movement is of Khrushchev, but the words are of CIA. I'm not joking. That a JNU professor could think this could happen in the 60s is really incredible. But the fact is, nobody knew. And I dare say, if you were to, it's such a, ambrosia of, how do you say, utopia, and everyone was taken in by this whole wind called communism. I dare say, half of this hall would be communist in the 1920s. I certainly would be, because I'm from JNU.
1920s, not many people knew about communism.
Yeah, but Bhagat Singh was, 20s, right? So. Yeah, so, during that time, and so, to take pride in the fact that Bhagat Singh was a communist and everyone else wasn't, or, he was not a communist, he was, at that point of time, the labels simply had no meaning whatsoever. Right now, yes, I can say with some certainty that labels do go on to identify, a particular proclivity, but then again, because Shiv is a journalist, I would like to perhaps even ask Sanjeev and you, or throw it open to the thing that how, when we constantly talk about, how polarized the electorate is, or, the voters are, do we spare a thought about how polarized our journalists themselves are? They are the people who are supposed to give us the news absolutely objectively. Whenever they raise any issue or they talk about it, they are supposed to at least say, has this thing happened before? Is there past precedence? That is how scientifically and objectively and rationally, you go about talking about things. But right now, I'll be, out of 100 journalists, I don't think more than a couple are doing that, and those couple are possibly in this hall. So away from this also, this thing about labeling that Shiv talks about, how true is that in establishing our psyche right now in contemporary times, Sanjeev? For a start, are you a Sanghi?
Yeah, maybe. Who never went to a shaka, as a famous book now says. Well, it depends what you mean. As I said, even those labels tend to be, you have to be very careful about them. So today, for example, when you think of the Democrats and the Republicans, you get, the Republicans are painted as being the party of the white supremacists, and the Democrats as being the flag bearers of freedom and minorities and so on. Do remember that in the Civil War, it was the Republicans who represented the North and were anti-slavery. It was the Democrats who were trying to continue slavery. Do always remember that these labels can be very misleading. They change in flavor at various points in time. The ideas may not. There were white supremacists then, and there are white supremacists now as well. But labeling can be quite messy, and I think I mentioned this earlier as well. When you talk about the right and the left in the 1920s, or you talked about socialists, socialism or the left simply meant people who were anti-colonial or basically anti-establishment. So ironically, in his own book, Netaji writes about how the Lal Bal Pal trio are leftists, and he talks about Gandhi, etc., as being the rightist, i.e. they being in favor of the current establishment. So there are these kinds of labels that get thrown about, but my own sense is that it is not, I'll also not be too harsh about using labels, in the sense that it is a useful shorthand when having casual conversation, but it needs to be taken into context of the times.
So Sanjeev and Anandji both, one of the things that Kunal mentions very clearly in his book, and he's not kind of mincing words, he names names, and these are all contemporary people. He talks about, he mentions about an incident somewhere in the early 2012, 2011, there was a track to diplomacy going on with Pakistan, where at some point of time it was decided between some officers and some bureaucrats and certain politicians to demilitarize Siachen. Kunal, along with some of the serving military officers at that time, fought it tooth and nail. And I think during one of the launches of this book by Professor Debroy, he did mention very guardedly that he checked with certain people in the government at that time whether how true it was. And Professor Debroy said that he did not get a no for an answer. So would you guys be able to talk anything about what would have happened to Siachen, or what your take would be if we were to demilitarize it today or at any point of time?
Well, I don't know what happened. I haven't studied the particular subject and I didn't ask anybody about it. So I'll go with whatever Shiv Kunal has to say. But I will make a larger point. There remains, and has been for a long time, as I said, we can use now in a modern context a collaborationist class in India, which always wants to do this compromise because of a few plates of biryani in Lahore. And I have never understood this. This is very well ingrained even to this day in certain parts of the bureaucracy. And because I now have a somewhat bad reputation, people are now more careful about conversing about and expressing themselves about this. But even as recently as 2017-18, when I had just joined the government, and my somewhat militant views may not have been as fully known in the system as before, I would routinely come up with, this kind of conversations in, casually. That was the conversation at a certain arena, let's say in IIC or in a dinner party, etc. This was the default to which everybody says. So even if you agreed with something else, you had to first defend it against this general default. And I would love to find out why this collaborationist default happens. One of my theories is partly it has to do with the continuation of the collaborationist class after independence as being our upper middle class, intellectual class. That may be part of the story. But it is quite interesting. I have been recently reading up a lot on African social media. And it turns out that this is quite systematic. The systematic use of dollarized salaries of aid agencies to essentially buy out the children of the elite and the bureaucracies of developing countries is quite a common and systematic thing. And so therefore I would argue that this triangle of Khan Market, Lodhi Road, and IIC, and all the institutions that are there, and the systematic buying out over time of our elite even after independence, including systematically incorporating even new blood into this collaborationist class, is something that is not generally happening. It is something that is done systematically with a certain sort of intent in mind.
I know only one person who dines at Khan Market, stays at Lodhi Road, and is an ISC member. No.
As it happens to me, I don't.
No, but when you talk to, it's a very important issue that you talked about, and it's very closely knit with journalism. And of course, these are layman's opinion. And before I came into public eye, I would have said, I'm sorry, I don't have enough expertise to talk about it. But then in Fellini's 8½, the main protagonist, Guido, gets up on the rostrum and says, I have nothing to say, but I'll say it anyway. So like that, I'll give you my opinion right now. A lot of journalists were hankering for this track 2, track 1 diplomacy with Pakistan, especially after the bus ride. And I remember the same time, 2010, 11 and everything. And Sanjeev asks a very important question, which is, why would you do it? What is your incentive? I mean, surely they were rich enough, and you know, chai samosa ke liye, biryani ke liye koi Lahore kyun jayega? Yahi Kareem mein kha lega, you know. So why would you do it? Is it by habit, or is it by actually an anti-India agenda, bit by bit, brick by brick? And I really don't know the correct answer to that, and I think it might be the latter, because there are some people who you can see through their agenda within 5 minutes. And then you know they would never work for India, they would never be for India, they would never work for Indian interests. Yes. No, but he's worked tremendously in India's interest ever since he made that chai wala comment. I mean, he has anointed Modi as the Prime Minister, so, you know, you're wrong there. No, but I mean, I meant Gilani, Saeed Shah Gilani, because you're talking of Pakistan, Kashmir and all that. And the reason why I say this is because you've seen so many editors, journalists, you know, be so close to Gilani, go and have chai with him, biryani with him, and lunch with him, call him on conclaves. He has been to Delhi so many times, he's spoken on, you know, what is the thing. And when I say that, you know, one can see through these people within 5 minutes. It's possibly even less than that, because I'll make it even less for you, because I've taken extracts from his own book. And I want to read those out, because it will become very clear, you know, why people still hanker to talk to these people. So these are extracts from Gilani's book, Naya-e-Hurriyat, right? I'll just tell you what his thought process is. These are some quotes taken from it. And Gilani was the one, you remember, and Sai is right, Manishankar Iyer, the HT editor-in-chief, and so many other journalists. So many have gone and met him and wanted. So this is what, these are Gilani's sayings. Muslims are a qawm wholly separate from the Hindus. Muslims are a complete separate nation on the basis of their religion, culture, civilization, customs and practices and thought. Their nationalism and the foundation of their unity cannot be based on their homeland, race, language, color or economic system. The basis of their unity is Islam and Islam alone. Pakistan was created for the hegemony of Islam and for establishing an Islamic system. Pakistan is the land of the dreams of all Kashmiris because it was one in the name of Islam. Accession to India would result in the Kashmiri Muslim having to live perpetually under Hindu slavery. The entire struggle of the Kashmiri people is for the sake of Islam and for the accession to Pakistan. It may seem like these are extracts from some guy saying, you know, Sai has referred to them in his book, but, you know, this is across time, across space. What was said by, you know, some bigot 100 years ago mentioned in Sai is being repeated by Gilani. Kashmir must become an Islamic state. Our goal is the establishment of Islamic government. Our struggle is for the sake of Islam. Islam removes people from the slavery of people, but secularism makes the people slaves of Delhi. And these journalists were calling Gilani as secular. The ongoing struggle against Indian rule in Kashmir is not an ordinary war, but rather a jihad. India is a bigger enemy of Islam and Muslims than Israel. I plead with the Afghan Mujahideen to come forward to help liberate us from India, and by doing so, express their bond of Islamic brotherhood and religious commitment. In the light of the Quran, it has now become incumbent on the people of Pakistan to engage in jihad in Kashmir. These are the words of the guy who our editors and journalists were hugging and having tea and biscuits and wanting track to. I mean, what more can be said, you know?
Fair point, Dr. Ranganathan. One of the other things that Kunal's book stands out for is that fact that he and Shekhar Gupta were very deeply involved in covering the Punjab terrorism, plus the Operation Blue Stars. About 3 or 4 days back, there was an interview with one of the army generals who went in, General Kuldeep Singh Barar, with Smita Prakash, I think, in one of the interviews. And he mentioned very clearly that there are some people calling it a botched up operation. The some people is Kunal. So he starts the description of Operation Blue Star as that it was a completely botched up operation. And since he got a very close, a very bird's eye view. In fact, just to recount from my memory of what is written there, he He was, I think, 21 or 22 years old at that time, and he was an AP journalist, just a couple of years old, and he was somewhere caught in Calcutta in torrential downpour, and his father, at that time, he was, I think, the 11th Division Commander in Jalandhar. They were frantically searching for him, and finally they get hold of him, and they tell him that there is going to be a flight for him at the Kolkata airport at such and such time, and he needs to get on that flight come what may. There were apparently, he describes it as 4 feet of water right up to the airport. So somehow he gets on the flight, and he's, kind of amazed to discover that's an Airbus 300. This is 1984, just brand new Airbus 300s. So with 300 passenger capacity, and he's the only passenger with 12 warehouses in it. That he also mentions very clearly. And he lands in Delhi, he lands at the Palam the technical area, and he's flown from there straight to Chandi Mandir, which is the headquarters of the Western Command. At that time, General Sundarji was the chief of Western Command. So he's kind of driven into his room, and he's put there, and he's asked to describe what he saw in Golden Temple during his last visit. Apparently, he was the last serious journalist who was inside the Golden Temple for any long or protracted period of time. And Kunal starts by telling him that, sir, as far as I'm concerned, I have counted 64 LMGs. And on that comment, General Sundarji gets up and tells him that you journalists love playing generals, you have no idea what you're talking about, and he walks off. So after having flown him from Kolkata and done all this, all he spent with General Sundarji was 2 minutes, and what Kunal was trying to tell him, he wasn't even heard of. So apparently later on, General V.K. Singh was a major at that time, and he was there with his boss. So especially with the meetings with Mrs. Gandhi, General A.S. Vadya, the Chief of Army Staff at that time, repeatedly told Mrs. Gandhi, don't do it. This is not, there is frontal attack on the Golden Temple. This is not a good idea for XYZ reasons, and this is not going to end well. While the meeting was going on, General Sundarji drives in, walks in, sweeps Mrs. Gandhi off the feet and says that this is how we'll do it, this is how it is done. And kind of General Vaidya was moved to the sidelines. And the attitude at that time, as described by General V.K. Singh later on, was that all our Indian army had to do was show up, and the terrorists would just, exact words, shit in their pants and leave their guns and run away. That is not what happened. So ultimately, I think about after 36 hours of sheer butchery, they had to bring in tanks and break. The whole idea was to save the Akal Takht in the Golden Temple. That never happened. So that is why Kunal's assertion that it was a botched up operation, because it was not planned through. So would you guys have any ideas about that part of narrative?
Well, as a child of the 80s, I lived through that, I remember. But of course, the media was heavily censored, and completely, Doordarshan was completely controlled by the government. So I only have one version of it. And you're absolutely right, it was a botched up operation. It's only 20 years later down the line I got to know that...
We are suffering even today because of that operation. Yes. Khalistani movement gets a new fillip every time they talk about the Blue Star.
Yeah, they don't talk about that a lot of soldiers mutinied. They didn't want to go in. That's a very sensitive thing. They don't talk about that. But 4 years down the line, or 3 years down the line, there was, I think, was it Black Thunder? That happened during Rajiv Gandhi's time. And everyone, when that thing started, all of us thought that, my God, this is a repeat. This is going to be a repeat of Blue Star. But it wasn't. It was one of the most successful operations. And during that time, and what I mean to say is not so much the planning, it is how you execute an ongoing operation. So a man who dressed up as a rickshawala, he drove his rickshaw all the way to Harminder Sahib, and he just walked in. And the main terrorist, I forget that guy's name, during Black Thunder. And this guy said, ISI has sent me, and he infiltrated that thing, and there were 74 bombs that were planted all across Golden Temple, including Akal Takht. And one by one during night, he diffused all those bombs. And later on, the terrorists had to surrender. Do you know who that guy was? He was Dawal. So it was not planned at all. He just went in, he volunteered, I'll just go in. So, some things just happen, quirk of fate, and it was one of the most successful operations in Rajiv Gandhi's, Punjab could have been, had that happened to the stage of
Probably worse
Blue Star,
off,
Punjab
yeah.
would have been lost. Any memories of that era?
No, I mean, I, like you, grew up in the 80s. I read whatever the official documents were. I can't claim I have any particular insight into it.
But
So
we
another
actually thought Punjab was lost, to be honest. I mean, children of the 80s, there used to be transistor bomb blasts, and where people would be taken out of buses and shot down, lined up and shot down. We thought Punjab is gone until KPS Gill came and,
So another interesting incident, insight into the same thing from Kunal is that when Kunal came back, they were both working at India Today at that time, Shekhar and Kunal. So when Kunal came back and filed his
working
report,
on the coup story.
No. So that's another thing that features in the book, the reality of the coup story.
So why don't you tell us that?
The coup story.
The coup story.
So apparently, it was, again, I'm quoting Kunal here, I have absolutely no knowledge or information about the inner workings of the government either way. I mean, much less, I'm much at periphery than you guys are. But according to Kunal, one of the, this was kind of a planted story. And Kunal walked into Shekhar's room on 5th or 6th of May when the story was kind of published and challenged him that why would you tell such blatant lies? Because for a very simple reason that these exercise, what was the accusation? The accusation was that on 31st of January, early morning, there was a armored regiment moving from Hisar towards Delhi, which is basically what they were trying to do is measure how much time, depending upon what kind of obstacles you take to reach from point A to point B. Basically just an annual exercise of armored corps. By sheer coincidence, I think it was 10 paras which started off from Agra, again moving towards Delhi. This is the area of their operation. So this whole thing was picked up by one of the members of the government at that time serving, and this was conveyed to the journalists in question, and those journalists were apparently sat down and dictated what you're supposed to write. The biggest flaw in this story was that this happened on 31st of January. The story came out the day General V.K. Singh's hearing about his seniority or continuance as the Chief of Army Staff for another year that would start. So basically it was a complete plant to thwart any attempts of, to malign General V.K. Singh's attempt at getting his side of the story done. So that's the story of the
they
coup.
call journalism as the world's second oldest profession. Shekhar Gupta made it the oldest profession.
Why don't we open it up to
Yeah,
questions? That might be more fun. Yeah, there's a gentleman right at the end. Just a minute, we're getting a few mics to you.
So this may not be directly related to the topic or the book you are reading, but because you, Sanjeev Sanyal, is from Economic Advisory Council, I think I have the liberty to ask or get some kind of, thinking of the government in terms of, the floods that we saw in Pakistan in the last few months back, and it is a combination of several factors. It's not about the book. Yeah, that's only about the book? Yes. Okay, then I don't have it.
With regard to Punjab, since you mentioned Operation Blue Star and Operation Black Thunder, can you weave in the consequence and the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi with it? The consequence, the linkage?
I mean, there's a direct linkage. I mean, so this was obviously, Black Thunder happened later. So
and also, if you want the backdrop, that the genesis of the Punjab problem and who is Brindan.
So of course, as I said, there was a concerted effort from the century into the early 20th century of splitting Sikh identity away from Hindu identity. And the British heavily invested into it. Interestingly, so that I go back a little bit more, do understand that the first attempt of the British to wean away the Sikhs was not to emphasize Sikh identity, but was in fact to Christianize them. They tried to do that with Duleep Singh, and they invested huge amounts of effort into building various kinds of missionary institutions in Punjab, which by the way are still functioning, many of them. And so that was their very first attempt at splitting the Sikhs. But that thinking, however, evolved to saying that we don't have to Christianize them, all we have to do is to separate them from the Hindus and create a separate. And we see that particularly happening with the Gadar period, where of course they infiltrate all the Gurudwaras, not first in India, but outside of India, North America, Britain, and so on. So the genesis of this Khalistani idea happens abroad. Now, what happens is after independence, yes, you wanted to say something.
I was just trying to bring it to Alo's specific question of what is the...
yes, so
are you talking about the proximate cause of Blue Star, of why it led to Blue Star? I'll address it from 1977 when they lost the election onwards.
Yeah, so I want to tell you that there has been this thing among the Sikhs for quite some time, this split, so to speak. And it is needled all the time, of course, by the politicians. This includes, incidentally, the Congress itself, again, trying to needle this as a way of splitting the Sikhs themselves into various groups and try to utilize them in various ways for the electoral gain, which, of course, Mrs. Gandhi herself does, and there are many, many witnesses of the fact that Bhindranwale personally was given support by the Congress party ecosystem till he became way too big and something had to be done about him. So he was definitely a case of a Frankenstein. I'm not the first person who has made this point, but over to you.
So again, I'm quoting Kunal on this one. He's specifically spoken about, not only there is a RNAW officer who was on with Gaurav Arya a couple of days back. He describes exactly how this happened, that in 1977, after losing the elections to the Janata Party and Akali Dal combined, especially in Punjab, I think within a matter of 3 or 4 months, Sanjay Gandhi got in touch with Kamal Nath and asked for a plan to how do we come back to power in whenever we go in for elections next time. So, so keeping the fact that they needed to beat Akali Dal's agenda, they had to pick up a cleric. So they were about, according to some of the authors, including Kunal, there was an interview of sorts. You know, there were 5 or 6 clerics who were interviewed, and Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale, who by another coincidence used to live 10 kilometers from where my house in Moga, Punjab was selected because he looked to be the most militant and he looked to be the most powerful orator and all that. So keeping that in mind, he was promoted to, in inverted commas, take care of Akali Dal. And I think within a matter of 3 years, he just went out of hands. And there were 2 or 3 opportunities of arresting Bhindranwale, once in Hisar, another time again in Haryana, where it is rumored that the British SAS services guidance and consultancy was also needed so that they could do a helicopter drop and pick him up. But at last moment, all these operations were cancelled by Mrs. Gandhi, and he was kind of he kind of ballooned into a massive Frankenstein, and then we end up with Blue Star. Does that answer your question, Alo?
You have 5 more minutes. Sai wants to ask a question.
Just one question, and this connects to Mr. Sanyal's point about the British attempts at Christianizing the Sikhs in Punjab. Are we looking at a similar situation now? And is Punjab worse today than it was before, thanks to an irresponsible state government and the infusion of drugs and the normalization of the Khalistani sentiment, especially after the events of 26th of January 2021? What do you think of it?
Again, my
tractor parade.
Personal views. I'm not a journalist. I will just say a couple of lines and then pass them on to Sanjeev and Anand ji. Since I grew up in Punjab, I have seen Punjab from 1970s onwards. I was bang in the middle of the terrorism. My college was about 2 kilometers away from the... So many people don't know this, but on 6th of May 1984, the dress rehearsal for Blue Star was done in a Gurdwara in Moga. So there were about 30 odd deaths and a couple of CRPF and army people also got killed. So from that perspective, what I saw with my own eyes at that time was far worse in terms of optics. The fact that my college was shut down and there were about 300, 400 people who were arrested from my college for being followers or for being the militant followers of Janal Singh Bhindranwale. What I see now is a much more sophisticated attempt that is going on, and it is kind of permeating very deeply. What the difference in 1984 militancy was that if you, for example, in Kashmir, the militants would, I mean, pardon me for saying this openly, militants would pick up women and kind of trade them, take them over to POK, sell them over there. And the men folk would whimper and cry and complain कि उनके पास AK है, हमारे पास कुछ नहीं है. But they will do nothing. Similar things if they were, or when they were attempted in Punjab, one of the parties would die. So this time the militancy is not that masculine, if I may say so, much well thought out, much well planned, and therefore much well insidious.
There's no doubt that there is this continuous use of multiple levers, particularly now outside of India, in various ways to instigate Punjab in various ways. For example, you will go, if you go to where Valmiki's ashram used to be, where Love, Kush, etc. By the way, just outside Amritsar. You go there, in the name of Valmiki being Dalit and so on, there is a small new prayer room kind of thing that has been built there. And ironically, when I visited there a few years ago, the lecture, the sort of pravachan that was being given to young kids was that Valmiki was a Dalit hero and he was unnecessarily being, this whole story of the Ramayana has just been thopoed on the Dalit community, and there's a completely different and bizarre story that is wound out about who Valmiki was and what his relationship was with Ram and so on. And just utterly made up. But this is happening where, the Valmiki ashram is. It's not in some vague village. It's a part of the thing. And the same thing is being done with missionaries and evangelists of various kinds. The thing that you just saw with, of course, the farmers' movement and so on. All of these are very well funded, well orchestrated machinery with very close links outside of India. So yes, absolutely dangerous things that are being attempted, and of course now may be encouraged by even domestic political dispensations.
If I can just add 30 seconds. I never look at the criminal. I always look at the person whose responsibility it is to get at the criminal. So I don't look at the anarchists, I look at this government, and this government is weak. But it won't be for long. As soon as Modi gets the majority, I think we should be fine.
the book Hindutva, Origin, Evolution, and Future consists of 8 chapters. The first chapter is about the origin of the word Hindu and its relation to the term Hindutva. There is this beautiful story about Siddhartha saving the swan which was harmed by Devadatta, and the relation between Siddhartha's healing hands and the wounded swan, that is the relation between what we call Hindu Dharma and Hindutva. Look at the term Hindu. Usually it is said that the term Hindu has been given to us by the foreigners because it is essentially a geographical term, and it is to the people who are living on the other side of the Indus River. Here I try to give a new interpretation based on what you can call the basic evolution of human consciousness. There is a new emerging field called neuroarchaeology, which tries to understand what kind of cognitive processes happen in a mind of a civilization or culture based on the archaeological finds. One can think of a psychologist called Julian Jaynes as the person who gave the fundamentals for this new way of looking at civilizations. And he proposed something called the breakup of the bicameral mind, the collapse between the left brain and the right brain, and the conversation that they were having of an auditory hallucination. And this gave rise to, he proposes that this gave rise to something called the axial gauge and the rise of monotheistic religions. This book came in 1970s. I think Richard Dawkins makes a very interesting comment on this particular person, that he was a genius or he was a complete crackpot. Now, down the decades, there has been a lot of renewed interest in this particular bicameral mind hypothesis of the arise of human consciousness. And I interestingly found that Ram Swarup independently had given a very more thorough framework for understanding this particular process, where he, though he doesn't name it, he calls it a kind of a integration. There is a bicameral breakup, but a kind of a bicameral integration, and that it happened in India. And what is the difference? Instead of monotheism, a particular external unit is the God, which is being used to unite this into a single consciousness. What actually we have here is a unity, a fundamental unity, and we incorporated all the so-called divine voices, etc., inside the consciousness of the person. So this is something that resonates with Vedic religion. In fact, Julian Jaynes makes a single comment on the entire Indian civilization. Vedic religion is a kind of a bicameral religion, and it gravitated towards the Upanishadic time when the unitary consciousness arose. But actually we can find that this particular internalization, unity, the basis come there in Vedic religion itself. You have this whole story of the two birds sitting on the branches, etc. Now, we can also note another one aspect from this particular point of view. You have the yoga seals in Indus Valley civilization. The yogi seals show that humans have developed at that time, Indian civilization has developed the concept of consciousness, and a means of going inside this unitary consciousness that is existing, and that resonates actually with the Upanishadic time. So, irrespective of what the archaeologists say, this particular framework allows Upanishadic time to the period. Archaeologists may differ. This is a strong possibility. And a kind of division arises now. The division between what the Zoroastrian and But there is yet another development, that is, instead of just monotheism, they tend to develop something called monopolistic religion. So in monopolistic religion, in monotheistic religion, you talk about an extra-cosmic God, a creator God. In monopolistic religion, what happens? There is not only an extra creator God, but that is only true God. All other gods become false. So you have Ahriman and you have Agra Mazda. Agra Mazda is the god of light, Ahriman is the god of darkness. So all your theological enemies can be seen in this framework, and they can be called as the agents of Ahriman. So it is Christianism that first this monopolistic religious concept arises. And they see the Vedic religion with a kind of disdain. There is this interesting inscription some 2500 years ago, which talks about the demolition of the temples of the Devas by the Swarajya kings and the establishment of the true god of Agra Mazda. You can just have to remove Agra Mazda and you have to remove the Deva temples. You can keep the Deva temples even, and you have to put in another one name, and you would have a statement by Alauddin Khilji. So actually have this particular monopolistic arising, and they have a disdain for the religion that exists in this side of the Indus, and it is here first you have the term Hindu. So in inscription, this word Hindu arises. But what is actually the original source of the word Hindu? In Rigveda, and this was identified by, again interestingly, Airavata Mahadevan, who was a Dravidianist, and he was studying the Rigveda, and he had a convoluted theory actually. He says that the Soma ritual actually belongs to Rigvedic, to the Harappan civilization. And he says that it is the Soma ritual with the filter that is being represented in this unique seal. And he states that that particular small drops you can see actually, if you look at that unicorn seal of the Harappan civilization, you can see small drops coming out. And he says that these drops were called Hindu. Now the Soma filter comes out as drops, and it is called Hindu at one point. In the river Sukta of Rigveda, the branch of Indus, Sindhu, is called Susoma. So now you have the dots of Susoma as one of the branches of the Sindhu river in river Sukta. You have Hindu that is related to Soma, and in later period you have Soma, Hindu related to moon. So all these dots are already there in place. And next what you see, Huan Swan, almost I think 1300 years ago, he comes here and he writes about this nation, and he says that this nation is called Hindu. He writes this nation is called Hindu. That is some 700 years before Rajaraja Chola. He identifies, in fact Huan Swan had come to Kanchi also. So he had come to South India also, so he calls the entire nation as Hindu. And he says, why? Because not of the Indus River. And he gives a spiritual meaning to this. He says, this nation shines like moon when there is spiritual darkness because of its rishis and jnanis and the bodhisattvas and others. And this nation is called Hindu. So you have not only Hindu, not geographical term, but also as a sacred term emerging. And you see this term again arising during the Krishnadevaraya's time, during the Vijayanagara Empire times, Hindu Raya comes. So the term has always been there, and what does it represent? It represents the theodiversity of this land. As I said, the monopolistic expansionist forces, they always want to destroy theodiversity. The term theodiversity was coined by Yogesh Chandra, a Buddhist scholar. So whenever this monopolistic expansionism tries to destroy theodiversity, the Hindu becomes important. It is like your immune system. Despite all the diversity inside, when a hostile thing enters, your immune system reacts with the concept of an unified self. then only the concept of the unified comes. The same way, in a natural religion like Hindu, the term Hindu naturally arises whenever there is a threat to what the course of this deals with it. And the term Hindu has been Savarkar's definition of the term Hindu. I think 1940s, when Savarkar wrote Thoughts on Pakistan, he zeroes in on this definition of Hindu. Savarkar says that anyone who considers this nation Punya Bhumi or Pitru Bhumi is a Hindu. So Ambedkar notes that this actually is a very brilliant definition because everybody except. So the tribals are Hindus, people who believe in the Vedas are Hindus, people who don't believe in the Vedas, who don't know about the Vedas, they are also Hindu. Arya Samajis are Hindu, Brahma Samajis are Hindu. So this gives a theoretical basis for the term Hindu, he says. And when he creates the Hindu code bill, he uses the same definition there. He doesn't say anyone who considers this nation as Pitrubhumi and Punyabhumi. Rather, he says that anyone who is not a Jew or a Christian or Muslim or Parsi, all those people are Hindu. So this is the journey of. And Savarkar also says that Hindu is essentially a universal set of which Hindu Dharma is a subset. We have to understand here that when he is talking about this Hindu Dharma, he is talking about the popular concept of Hindu Dharma as the Vedic religion. It has its own greatness, great contribution, but it is part of the great civilizational process. And interestingly, the first person to use the term Hindutva as a civilizational process was not Savarkar. Savarkar improved upon it. The first person who used this was Rabindranath Tagore. The Hindutva had already been used, but as a civilization, as representing the civilizational process, as the basis of civilizational process, the use of the term Hindutva, the credit goes actually to Rabindranath Tagore. And we come to the second chapter. The second chapter is about Bharat Mata. There has been a propaganda that Bharat Mata is actually a colonial import. So this chapter goes into the roots of Bharat Mata, right from the Vedic times, into the culture that has been in Tamil Nadu, in terms of the Sangam literature, Chilapadiharam, and then it shows how every time there has been a fight that is needed to protect this nation, this goddess who takes a weapon, she has surfaced in the consciousness of this nation. For example, we have Madura Vijayam, written by Ganga Devi, where she talks about how Kampana Nayaka comes to dislodge the Madurai Sultans, who had actually closed the temples and who have been butchering the cows everywhere and who have been threatening people and tyrannizing them to convert their religion. At that time, Kampana Nayaka has been sent. Kampana Nayaka comes here. He captures Kanjipuram and he becomes complacent. His real goal was to liberate Madurai, but after capturing Kanjipuram, he becomes kind of complacent. And then in his court appears a woman and a sage. She takes a sword and tells that this was the sword that was given to the Cholas and the Pandyas by himself. And I am offering this to you now. You take the sword of Dharma and you. So God takes the weapon and uses it to, comes there. And the sword of Shivaji was called Bhavani, and the sword of dagger of Guru Govinda Singh was called Bhagavati. Not only that, we can tell that this all comes in this particular culture. These stories have arisen. When they were capturing Nagaland, Rani Gudinu, she has a vision. She goes into a village, sitting on a tiger, a goddess gives her a rifle. So this goddess, who gives you weapons to fight against these monopolistic forces. She comes again and again in history, and it is this that has come out as Vande Mataram and Bharat Mata during the colonial times. So that's about the second chapter. About what actually we mean by the protection of cow and how this worship of cow has been there in the Hindu culture, who are all have defended it. In fact, the entire freedom was to cow protection. When Britishers captured this nation, they wanted to, in a very big manner, in a very corporate manner, in an industry, because they wanted them to be the food for their soldiers who would go and campaign in other parts of Asia, like Afghanistan and other regions. But what was stopping all this was the cow protection, the cow veneration that has been there with the Hindus. And even the so-called bowed down when they were under the Marathas. So the Britishers, they tried to get some pundits and write that cow eating was already there in the Vedas, etc., etc. And they tried to make this look like it was a very progressive thing, etc. And at that time, in Tamil Nadu, there was the saint Vallalar. And when he writes, and now you have to remember that Vallalar is being co-opted, is the entire Dravidian movement and this Dravidian Christian movement, it is trying to appropriate Vallalar. If you look at Vallalar pictures, 10 years before, he would be wearing vibhuti. If you look at Vallalar pictures now, vibhuti would be erased, and he is shown as a kind of anti-Vedic, anti-caste warrior, social warrior. Actually, he was definitely against social discriminations, but he was not anti-Vedic. He openly states, and he was one of the earliest persons to talk in Tamil Nadu about the nature of Hindu family against the Abrahamic family of religion. It is Hindu family of religions that can actually impart to Vallalar, that can impart to a person immortality. If this particular science is present in other religions, it is an approximation of what is present in Hindu Veda Gamas. That is what Vallalar wrote. Now just think, such a person is being appropriated, and that means how much weak we have become. Okay, now coming back to this. So Vallalar understands one thing, that if India is made into a nation of cow eaters, into a nation of cow butchers, then our civilizational back spine could be actually broken. Had that happened, the famines would have been severe, even more severe, and we would not have been able to stand again. So Vallalar actually, he writes, his first book, what he writes is about the story of Manunidi Chola, in which, as most of you would be knowing, the Chola king has a son who had accidentally run his chariot on a calf, and then the cow comes and demands justice to the Chola king. What the Chola king does is, now it is very important, the Brahmin ministers in his court, they are telling that there is prayashita. There are prayashitas by which you can actually remove this particular sin. But the king demands that justice should be done, and then the king describes to his courtiers, basically his Brahmin ministers, the greatness of the cow. In which part of the cow, which deity resides. He elaborately talks about it and then tells, so to get that cow justice, I would kill my own son. Now he places his son in the wheel of chariot and he runs the chariot over the sun. Okay, this is a very celebrated story in Tamil Nadu, and Vallalar chooses this story. The reason is because he knows that if cow slaughter happens, then India's civilizational spine will be broken. In the north, you have the famous Kuka movement, which was the first Swadeshi movement. And they also fight because they wanted to protect the cow. So this is about the cow protection that happened, and what are all the things that have been happening after that. And here I mentioned about Mahatma Gandhi also. So Mahatma Gandhi took the cow protection, and he was actually a proto-Hindu ecological thinker. We can consider him that. Okay? And he states that this cow protection is symbolic of, it is the greatest civilizational value of this country, and based on this, we can actually show that we respect all life, and he wants Hindus to do an outreach to the Muslims, convert them to protect the cow, to venerate the cow. That would have been a great, what I would call a conversion movement from the side of the Hindus. Okay, so that is about the cow protection aspect. And the fourth thing that we are coming to, the fourth chapter talks about social equality, racism, etc. One of the charges that has been always leveled against Hindutva is that Hindutva is a kind of a Desi version of racism and Nazism. So here the chapter talks about the important contributions of the Hindutvites to the social emancipation of this land. Right? So if you look at any society of that period, you would find that the marriage age of girls was very lower. And it was around 1869, 1889, like that, they were actually changing. And for your information, in the Roman Catholic canonical laws, till very recently, the marriage age of girls was very, very low. It was only after Francis came that he understood this could create very bad publicity that he changed it. Till then, the marriage age was very low, and they had this provision that wherever you live, you have to adapt to the land of that particular, the law of that particular land. Okay, now this marriage age, here also it was very low, and people used to say that this is our religion, and you should not touch it. Those who actually ran a campaign against this, they were not Christian missionaries, they were not European reformers, it was a person called Harbilas Sharda. This Harbilas Sharda was a strong Hindutvaite. He wrote a book called The Superiority of Hindu Civilization. He was the first person to talk about a pan-Asian Hindu-Buddhist alliance to counter Arabian as well as the European onslaught. He was also an Arya Samaji, and he was the one who was responsible for raising the marriage age. And this created a great social revolution. And this social revolution in this nation was created by Hindutvites. That is our legacy, our heritage. And then, this is 2023. In 1923, in the Bombay Legislative Assembly, a resolution was passed. This resolution was moved by C.K. Bole, Sitaram Keshav Bole. And this resolution said that the scheduled community persons should be free to go and use the public water bodies. They should be free to walk the public roads. They should be free to use the public parks, etc., etc. That was a very important resolution act, and it was made into a law, Bole law. And it was based on this law that the Magat Satyagraha starts. And Dr. Ambedkar's Magat Satyagraha is one of the very important events in the history, social history of India, as we all know. And when case was put on Dr. Ambedkar, etc., very important Hindu Mahasabha leader was the witness in favor of Dr. Ambedkar, that was Narayan Damodar Savarkar. Vinayak Damodar Savarkar could have gone there, but he couldn't because he was under house arrest. So he couldn't leave Ratnagiri actually. So he couldn't come. Narayan Savarkar went, and he was the person who was actually injured, very, very seriously injured during the Gandhi assassination after riots. And he died because of that. This was a person who fought not only for freedom, political freedom of this nation, but also social freedom of this nation. So this C.K. Bole resolution is the most important resolution. Who was this C.K. Bole? C.K. Bole later joined Provincial Hindu Mahasabha. And then when Dr. Ambedkar was going to Constituent Assembly, he meets him at the airport and puts a demand. You should recommend the saffron Bhagava flag as the national flag of India. So look at the kind of contribution they have made. When scheduled communities were very much oppressed, it was the great Hindu Mahasabha leader, Jayakar, Parister Jayakar, who actually passed a resolution telling that there should be reservation for scheduled communities in police forces. So you cannot categorize the Hindu Mahasabha people as kind of, or Hindutva movement as kind of patriarchal, Brahminical, etc., etc. These were all loaded terms. In terms of social emancipation of this land, Hindu Mahasabha and Hindutva movement has contributed more than most others. So that is about the chapter. Then the next chapter talks about the non-sung Hindutva leaders, the controversies, etc. related to them. So it talks about, for example, Veer Savarkar, Munje meeting with Mussolini, for example. So it has been said by that Italian scholar that Munje actually met Mussolini, and it was this fascist influence that led to the formation of RSS. The reality is completely different. Why did Munje go to Europe and meet Mussolini? Did he meet only Mussolini? Actually, Munje visited all the military schools throughout Europe. He went to England, he went to England, he visited the military schools there. He went to France, he visited the military schools there. He went to Germany, he visited the military schools. He went to Italy, he visited the military schools. And at that time, Mussolini was considered as a person who was favoring Indian independent movement. There was a great leader in India who used to tell everyone who comes to him to go and visit Italy and see Mussolini. His name was Mahatma Gandhi. So that was the kind of atmosphere that existed then. But why did Mussolini go and why did Munje go and visit Mussolini and the military schools? Because he was part of a committee. And this committee was asking for complete recruitment. At that time, this British had this idea that there were only few communities that were military communities, and these martial races or martial jadis alone could be recruited for army. So there was no universal recruitment. Munje was fighting for universal recruitment. All the jadis, irrespective of which jadi a person belongs, should be recruited into the army. So Munje wanted to state his case with very good evidence. He went and he saw how this military training is given to students throughout Europe, and he found that it was universal military training, and he was actually substantiating his case. For that he visited. In other words, the British were implementing a pseudo-scientific racial theory, which is very similar to the Nazi concept, and Mussolini was building a case against this. Munje was building a case against this, and he was for universal military recruitment. So these completely different things. How this has been made into by propaganda is very interesting. So it deals with this kind of myths in this chapter. Then we come to the RSS. The different myths relating to RSS, the kind of studies that have been made about RSS today. Our Dr. Vikram Sampath talked about them, and Anand, Ranganathan, they talked about mixing of fiction and fiction, etc. When I was going to Shagas, that was when I was 14, I was going to Shagas, and at that time this Bhopal gas happened. And one of the stories they used to tell in the Shagas is how the RSS people were going and how they were there along with the military, only the RSS people were there rescuing people, etc., etc. But you don't find all that in any of the books around you. Okay. Later, Dominic Lapper, who died recently, who was the author of Freedom at Midnight, he came out with a book called Bhopal. In that book, he gives the entire credit to Teresa of Calcutta. She went and she, at once when the Bhopal tragedy happened, she goes there along with some sister. She goes there, the sister was a fictional character. They go and they work with the people. And what did the Indian army do? The Indian army completely cordoned off entire Bhopal and didn't allow anybody to go out. And it was, the Indian government was as if killing the people, and it was Mother Teresa who was going and serving the people there, despite the fact that the army was very oppressive. Almost 25 years ago, this kind of a narrative is being given as fiction. And I remembered very well that Teresa went there for one reason. Teresa went there, of course. She went there so that she could lobby to release the chairman of Union Government. That was the reason she went there. She didn't go there to help the victims. But the whole thing has been changed. And I went and asked the RSS people, actually, if there are any RSS people here, they should forgive me. They went and asked the RSS people, do you have any photos? I want to write an article about this. Do you have any photos of you people helping the victims? Then the RSS people gave their characteristic answer. Gee, no. See, we are helping our brothers. Why should we take pictures of we helping our brothers? That was the answer they gave. Then when I was searching, I found a particular person. He was a Christian, who was a photographer. You remember that famous photo of a child, only the face of the child and the hand would be on the child. That photo was taken by him. And he had put an online photo exhibition. In that photo, and he was naturally he was anti-RSS, anti-BJP, etc. But he had put these photos. In that photo, there were these half-pint walas going and serving people, etc. So what I heard in my shaga was actually validated by these photos, but our people didn't care to even document these things. As I said, these young people, they always think, okay, we are doing the seva, what is wrong? Why should we take a photo and why should we publicize it? But then the narrative is getting set like this. And also another one important aspect of RSS that this book discusses is about how within a small period of any disaster, RSS has been able to go and reach a particular place. Anywhere in India, whether the disaster is man-made or a natural disaster, the first persons to go and reach that place during that particular golden window time, they were the RSS people. How RSS made it possible? There has been no study on this. There has been no study on this. There are a lot of academic studies demonizing RSS, but this crucial aspect, this cost-effective organization, it does not need a building, it just needs a small ground, and it does not have membership, yet it is able to bring together the cadre at any particular time of disaster. Even where RSS is weak, they are able to bring together the cadre to help people, irrespective of caste, jati, religion, etc. And there is a very great quote by Guruji Golwalkar. Whenever you talk about Guruji Golwalkar and quote, there is only one quote everybody uses is in 1939, when he told that there is this, we have to learn this lesson from Germany and how she has purged the other races, etc., etc. There is a clear explanation of what actually he said and in what context he said, etc. in that particular book. But here, what happens here is that Guruji Golwalkar instructs the RSS cadre in a personal letter that was published very long time later. In a personal letter, not for publicity, in a very personal letter, he tells this. When you are going and serving people, don't differentiate them based on religion, caste, etc. When you serve them with the notion that you are serving the divine. The way a priest would be offering puja to the deity in the Garbhagriha, the same way you get to serve a person. That is the words of a person who had been depicted as a monster in the general discourse. This is about the RSS. Then there is a chapter on science and Hindutva. And this particular chapter I talk about today, interestingly, it is February 12, which is Darwin's Day. Okay? Darwin Day is celebrated, it was his birthday, so Darwin Day is celebrated to celebrate evolution. J.B.S. Haldane once said that with the discovery of natural selection, actually Darwin converted the entire Europe in principle to Hinduism. An exaggeration, but it's a very important thing. So this particular thing deals with the kind of exaggerations that are being made in the name of Hindutva. I call it cargo cult Hindutva. It is not a derogatory term as such. Marvin Harris has explained what is cargo cult. So when the aborigines of certain Pacific islands, they understood that they have helped somehow in the creation of the modern civilization, but they have been denied the fruits of modern civilization. So they create this cargo cult where the West had to repay. The same way, we have actually done a lot of contributions, but we don't know how to express those contributions. And we have been denied education of this particular aspect. I will tell you one example for this, a very solid example. There was this great scientist called Pushpa Bhargava. He was a great scientist. He was a great institution builder also, okay, but he was also a propagandist. So they created in 1970s an exhibition called MOSE, Method of Science Exhibition. propaganda that was going on, and we were being denied completely our scientific heritage, and so naturally we get into pseudoscience and we tell that this has been already invented and etc. etc. But actually we have contributed substantially. This particular chapter deals with that aspect. And as reason is post-independence, when we needed a cyclotron, it was Manas Saha who brought in cyclotron, who first created the first nuclear facility, and in that he was actually helped by Shyam Prasad Mukherjee. Despite the fact that Manas Saha had some kind of a Marxist favoritism, despite that, it was Shyam Prasad Mukherjee and who helped him, and it was Jawaharlal Nehru who was trying to stop his work. So this is a very interesting aspect here. And we have Dr. Murli Manohar Joshi, who was the brain behind Chandrayaan. Most of us don't know that. He was the one who cleared entire papers for Chandrayaan. He also created TKDL, Traditional Knowledge Digital Library, which actually reduced biopiracy by, say, 70% or something. And this is again based on with Hindutva rootedness. All these aspects have been dealt in this particular chapter. The last chapter is about Samanvaya. There are two kinds of processes, we can say. One is a very theoretical process, it is called dialectics, which is a very mechanistic process. And then you have a very organic process, and that process is Samanvaya. Samanvaya actually takes in the different heterogeneous thought processes and tries to create a broad mosaic with kind of harmony. And here we explain this Samanvaya as the civilizational process that upholds the civilizational core value of theodiversity. And we deal with, in this particular chapter, I deal with how this Samanvaya worked with the Hindu family of religions like Vedic religion, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikh religion. In that particular Sikh religion, because just before we have been talking about it, I want to tell you one important aspect. The Sikh massacre that happened in 1984 didn't happen over one night or over one incident. The hatred against the Sikhs and the hatred of Sikhs against the Hindus, it was being built in a very gradual process, and Indira Gandhi government, the Congress government, knowing that it will create a grand human misery for generations, it was doing it for its politics. So the stereotype of terrorist Sikh and the stereotype of backward Hindu who was worshipping idols, etc., this was being created between both the communities, and then the Congress can play themselves as at one. They can be Janus faced, and they can tell that we are the only persons who to protect the Hindus from the Sikhs, and to the Sikhs they can tell we are the only minority defenders. So they were playing this game at that time. RSS was the only organization, despite the terrorists went and killed the Swayamsevaks in the Shakas, they went on telling the people that the Sikh culture is our own culture, the Sikh heritage is our own heritage. So I have produced in that some cover pages of the official RSS magazine in Tamil Nadu, where you don't have any Sikh population. You are not playing to the gallery. Here, you will find that around 1982 to 84, they have again and again told about the sacrifices that the Sikh Gurus did, what actually Sikh Gurus meant, etc., etc. So that has been shown in this particular aspect. And then we come to Christianity and we come to Islam. In the case of Christianity, it is a very interesting thing that this book talks about is, in Indian context, Christianity interacts with Hinduism in three ways. One is it tries for institutional appropriation of Hindu religious symbols and Hindu spirituality also. It's very, very, you can't even imagine what all the things that they have actually tried to do. How much time I have? How much more time I have?
20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay. Then, for example, there was in Kulithalai near Trichy, there is an ashram. The name of the ashram is Sachidananda Ashram. Okay, Sachidananda Ashram. And the person who founded that ashram was called Aswarupi Ananda. Okay, Aswarupi Ananda, he founded this ashram. His real name was monarch name. He was from France. This particular so-called ashram, in the registry of Catholic monasteries, it is registered as a Benedictine monastery, not as Sachidananda Ashram. This is for our consumption. Okay. And this Arupi Ananda, he started working models, a church very similar to a temple, etc., etc., so that people would get confused. Henry Lysaux, who was his successor, he went a step further. He assumed the name Swami Abhishtikananda. He wore this flowing saffron robes. He went and visited the Hindu temples, all the sacred places. Even a devout Hindu wouldn't have done that. At that time, 1950s. He went to Sri Rangam. He went inside. There was this board. He writes in his autobiography. There was this board that was telling that non-Hindus are not allowed. He just was, in a sly way, he went inside and he looked at all the people, their devotion, and at last they were giving prasada with the water and tulsi. He couldn't take it. He couldn't take it. At the same time, he exclaims in his, all this devotion, all these beautiful sculptures, to whom they should belong to. They should belong to this one true God of Christianity. Unfortunately, they are all going to these pagan gods. He goes to Elephanta caves. He goes to Elephanta caves and he looks, stands before that Mahadeva. He couldn't bear the beauty of it. He simply sits at that place and he cries and he says, this beautiful sculpture should belong to Christianity. And then he goes to Thiruvannamalai. He goes inside the Virupaksha cave and he sits there. He takes, wherever he goes, he also takes bread and wine. And then he conducts the Holy Mass there, telling that this place should one day belong to Christianity. And then he looks at the way people are flocking Ramana Maharishi. So he wants to train a boy as a Christian Catholic Ramana, an equivalent of Christian Catholic Ramana. Unfortunately, there is some interdenominational problem. The boy gets mixed away. So that Project Ramana didn't happen. Then there is this twist. One day, he goes near Rudraprayaga. And there also in a Shiva temple, he had done the same thing. He had taken the bread and the wine and he had conducted the commune. As he was passing by, he gets a heart attack. He falls down. And the people around there, they come, there's this sannyasi who had fallen down. They didn't ask about what religion you belong to, etc., what sampradaya, nothing. They help him in a very big way and he gets his life back because of the Hindus. And he starts wondering about this particular thing. He brings to question all the things that he had done so far. And even though he was doing it as a kind of just an experimental thing, all these yoga exercises, etc., that he had done, they also begin to have an impact on him. He writes in his diary, this church is keeping me still in the realm of Nama Rupa Vedas. I have to get out of this. I understand that, but I am wedded to the church, I cannot get out. So he becomes more and more critical of Christianity actually, and people start disliking him, etc. So these are examples given in the book about how Christianity tries institutional appropriation. Then there is another one where they wage a proxy war. They don't fight directly with you, rather they create a movement like the Dravidian movement, and through the Dravidian movement they fight. In fact, the Archbishop of Madurai, he had written a book 1950s called Christianity and Dravidian Movement, Christian Church and the Dravidian Movement. In that he states that Dravidian movement is the time bomb that we have placed to destroy Sanatana Dharma. Very clearly they have stated that. But now what has happened is that the Dravidian movement, your Sun TV is actually telecasting Ramayana, Mahabharata, Veer Hanuman, Veer Ganapati, Bala Ganapati, etc. serials. So there is a Samanvaya process that is actually even absorbing these Dravidian movements, and they are resisting it. And their wives they send for the temples, and they would be talking all kind of nonsense. They would be facilitating Christian conversion there, and the wife would be going and visiting the Hindu temples here. All these kind of schizophrenic activities are happening for the Dravidian movement. So the church has a contingency plan, SEMA. So they tell that this Dravidian movement has cheated you, let us go for a pure Tamil chauvinist movement. And the pure Tamil chauvinist movement would tell that the Murugan whom you worship is not actually a god, but actually your ancestor. So the Murugan worship is only an ancestor worship. If it is only an ancestor worship, what prevents a converted Christian from entering the temple and offering worship to his ancestor in the way he thinks is right? He can light a candle there. He can come inside and he can light a candle there. Right? So this kind of things are there in incubator ready to be unleashed once they get power. All these are happening. So that is the second way of interaction. Then there is a third way of interaction, which is directly you attack violently. Okay? It happened in Tripura, where NLFT, the National Liberation Front of Tripura, along with the Baptist Church, it went around and asked people to get converted. The Jamatia tribes were hunted, they were killed, massacred, etc. I think Sandhya Jain, who is the sister of Dr. Meenakshi Jain, she has written a book even about how these conversions happen in a violent way in Tripura. So these are all the way Christianity has been interacting with Hinduism in India. There are also exceptions. For example, the first book on RSS was written by a Christian priest. First English book on RSS was written by a Christian priest, Anthony Elinchivattam from Kerala. And then he came to Mumbai. He joined the freedom movement, etc. He was also a Gandhian. So he was the person who coined the term pseudo-secularism against the Nehru government. In 1951, he published this book. And he praised RSS as the quintessential patriotic movement, etc. Then there was one famous Anthony D. Malla. Anthony D. Malla wrote a book called Sadhana, and it became a classic, a spiritual classic, cutting across all religious sections. He was a Jesuit priest, but he told that the master that I talk about is not just Jesus, it is also Krishna, it is also Tao, Lords, etc., etc. And he said that, he wrote actually, Judas and Jesus are for me two movements of the same dance, etc. And the church was very angry. It completely prohibited his books. When Pope Benedict was Cardinal Ratzinger, even today there is this Inquisition office. It has another one name, but the Inquisition office is there. They published an edict telling that his books should be removed completely from all the places. So here is an example of how Christianity had been interacting. We should not forget the institutional aggression this monotheistic cults are unleashing. When we are studying the individual possibilities also that exist there, we should be very clear. So I have brought up this, and the RSS also had been having dialogue with the Christian community. There was this famous social reformer called Joseph Pulakunnal in Kerala, and he was against the institutional Christianity so much that he has been called the Judas of Kerala. And he was running a Kerala Indian church, an Indian national church, and he had a very wonderful dialogue with Dr. K. Sudarshan when he was the Satsanga Chalak of RSS. They agreed upon that there should be no conversions, that it should be Christian, whoever Christians are here, they should actually adhere to an Indian national church and not the Catholic Church or Church of England, etc. So this kind of dialogues have been happening. Then there is also an interaction with Muslims that also have been given in the book. So these are all broadly the way the Samanvaya is being dealt in the book in its last chapter. So this is about Hindutva as a process of consciousness, a process of civilization, a civilizational process. And it is a process also of resistance against monopolistic aggression. And we have a great responsibility to take this process forward, because this is the only model that exists for the entire humanity to manage constructively its differences with mutual respect. When Hindutva becomes strong, let us assume we are going to Australia, we are talking to the Aborigines, and we are going to the Uluru Rock there a Hindu can prostrate before it with the same devotion with which he would prostrate himself before Mount Kailash. That way, we would be validating the Aboriginal spirituality. We won't be converting them to Hinduism, we would be validating the Aboriginal spirituality of that place. The same way, the natural religions everywhere where they have been enumerated, whether Native Americans, whether it is the African spiritual traditions, in all these places, a strong Hindutva can validate the spiritual traditions. Then, naturally, the monopolistic religions will have to give up their monopolistic expansionism. We can create such a global civilizational pressure to make these religions leave out their monopolistic expansionism. We can actually dilute them. Sri Aurobindo actually has talked about this. Okay, about diluting these aspects of Islam and Christianity. We will be able to do it So with this, I end the lecture. Are there any questions?
Okay, I'm a dairy farmer, that's why I'm asking you this question about the cow. I don't know the average consumption of milk in India of our 1.4 billion population, but like just take it as 300 ml per person per day, which makes a lot of milk per day. So to produce that milk, say a cow is producing an average of 10 liters a day. So the number of cows we have to have, so the number of deliveries we have to have, 50% female, 50% male, sustaining those male calves without culling them is a huge economic loss. How does one go about it? Because goshalas can't cope, because I have gone and visited goshalas. They don't have the funds. People don't come up with that kind of money. So what's the solution?
Okay. Actually, I worked in Vivekananda Kendra in Sustainable Agricultural section. You would be knowing that, right? So we know one thing about this, that you should look at cow. In fact, K.M. Munshi had talked about this also in the parliament when he was agriculture minister, that we should also look at the cow for the manure that it produces and how this manure will play an important role in recycling of the nutrients. For example, you can use the manure for biogas production, small biogases. You can use them for biomethanation plants. For example, you can take the domestic waste and you can feed it to the biomethanation plant. But to inculcate the bacteria in it, you have to use the cow dung slurry. And once the slurry comes out, and interestingly, this was talked about by J.C. Kumarappa, who was a Gandhian, as you know. And he had talked about how biogas slurry can actually transform agricultural economics, etc., etc. So all these aspects should be taken into consideration when you are talking about a cow, okay, an old cow. When you are talking about an old cow, its economic utility should be seen in terms of all these aspects. And to my knowledge, such a study has never happened, number one. Number two, I will come to a particular thing that is there in this book, okay. We always talk about the overgrazing of the cow. And the reason why overgrazing is destroying the ecosystems, and so the cow should be killed. Okay, the cow slaughter should happen. So this is one of the arguments that have been put forth by the Sarkari environmentalists. Right from the time of Indira Gandhi during Salim Ali, they brought a Smithsonian scholar to India. They took this wonderful photo, I think it was Raghuram, I forgot, of the cow grazing on the land, a skinny cow, and they showed that how this overgrazing by the cow is destroying the forest, etc. Okay, but later they found that every village, so this was a propaganda that was done by the Indira Gandhi government in a big way to create this national parks and separate the villages from the forests completely. So the people cannot actually take their cows and graze in this land. What actually was happening was that these cows, the people would be taking the cows, they would be grazing the land, and the old cows, probably the tiger or anything would come and would take that cow away, etc. would happen. Or if the cows are dying, for example, then they would be taken for production of meat, for the skinning of the cow, etc. would be happening. That way, in India, beef production without cow slaughter, by the death of the cow mostly, or very old cow getting killed like mercy killing, that would make Indian beef ecologically better, superior to beefs everywhere else. Coming back to your question, the answer is we have not studied the complete economic aspect and the externals as well as the other aspects of the cow, the commons that the cow creates. All these have not been studied.
My question is actually specifically about the male cows, which are 50%.
I'm talking about the male cows. So the male cows also give cow dung, right? I mean dung, right?
Oh, male cows you're saying? Okay.
I mean male
Sorry,
buffaloes,
I didn't understand
male
that.
buffaloes.
Okay.
They also give dung, right? So these aspects have not been studied, number one. Number two, during the famines, it has been found that protecting your buffaloes, protecting the male part of the cow progeny have actually helped agriculture to revive itself. So taking this into consideration, we have to make an effort and we have to save them. That is the answer.
Sir, from the land of cow worshippers, Tamil Nadu, how it degenerated to a place where the North India is mocked as cow belt? What happened to us?
See, this is a very planned campaign, okay? Cow protection is there in our blood. Even today, it is in the urban television studios that people are talking about beef and people are mocking them as cow urine drinkers and all that, right? There is this famous minister in Madurai, you remember, who always used to mock us as cow urine drinkers, right? Komutra drinkers, that is how he used to mock us. He had a grandfather. His grandfather actually with Panchagavya, he installed the Ayyappa Vigraha that is now being worshipped in Sabarimala. So if we are Komutra drinkers, naturally his grandfather was also a Komutra drinker, he has to accept that. Okay? So the point is, if even today, if you go inside a Tamil Nadu village full of Dravidians, people who vote for DMK, go and tell that I would like to have a beef biryani, it will be very hard for you to come out of that village. Okay, that is the reality. When all these vicious campaigns were not happening, I will tell you an example, one example from popular culture. Okay, there was the movie in which a poor boy belonging to some other jati was in love with a girl who belongs to the zamindar of that particular village, etc. As usual, everything was happening. The father was adamant that he wouldn't give his girl to that boy. Okay. Then what happens? One day his cow falls into well. This boy rescues the cow. That moment the father decides he would give his daughter to that boy. The minute he saved my cow, I decided I would give my daughter to the boy. So this is the sentiment that is there. Everything else that is being told is absolute lie. Unfortunately, once you make a lie a fashionable thing, a fashion statement, it starts percolating. So we have to tell again and again that a person like Vallalar was for cow protection. There was a great scheduled community leader called Munuswamy who was in the parliament. And when the preamble of the parliament, the directive principles were read, and when the directive principles talked about the protection of cow and the progeny, this Munuswamy Pillai got up, he was a scheduled community representative from Tamil Nadu. He got up and said, as a Hindu, I am so happy that the directive principles have got cow protection in it. So that is the nature, okay? That is the nature of this society, irrespective of jati. This cow eating scheduled community, etc., beef as a food culture, etc., it is being wokeism, that woke actually, the Indic woke trend that is being created. That's how we have to see it. Okay. Yeah.